Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world where power doesn't roar, it hums. Where deals are made not in smoky back rooms, but in sunlit courtyards surrounded by men in linen shirts and eyes that never blink. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadows behind the throne, into the hushed corridors of Medellin's most enigmatic figure, Fabio Ochoa Vásquez. While the world knows Pablo Escobar, the bombings, the manhunts, the headlines, it's Fabio who kept the ledgers clean, the numbers tight, and the empire quietly thriving beneath the noise. He never fired a gun. He barely raised his voice. Yet billions moved at the stroke of his pen. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere cozy tonight, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The ranch is silent but for the occasional hoofbeat. It's the mid-1980s in Antioquia, and while the city of Medellin thrums with ambition and gunfire, Fabio Ochoa is watching a stallion canter around a pen. He's always loved horses, long before cocaine, long before the U.S. Treasury kept a file on him. His boots are polished, his shirt crisp, and his fingers linger on a leather bridle like it's a prayer bead. He's not like the others. While Pablo slouches with a pistol tucked into his waistband, Fabio sits like a diplomat, every movement thoughtful, every silence calculated. He doesn't brag, he doesn't shout. He listens, nods once, and people know what needs to be done. You might miss him in a crowd, but you'll feel it when he leaves. Many people still think that if you removed Fabio from the Medellin equation, the empire would have collapsed under its own weight. Too top-heavy, too wild. He was the anchor, the structure, a quiet man in a loud world. Born into a respected family, Fabio was the middle child. Between Jorge Luis, charming, charismatic, and Juan David, the fiery elder brother, Fabio found his niche where the books balanced and the questions stopped. He wasn't flashy. He was precise. Their father, a horse breeder and businessman, raised the boys with a deep sense of familial pride. The family ranch, La Hacienda Nápoles, would eventually become infamous. But in these early days, it was just home. It smelled of hay and tobacco. It echoed with hoofbeats and quiet Spanish conversations at sunset. Fabio loved order. He'd reorganize shelves that were already organized. When he was 12, he kept a notebook tracking the expenses of the family stable, down to the cost of each bale of feed. His mother joked that if one of her sons became president and the other became a poet, Fabio would be the one making sure the electricity bill got paid. And then came the opportunity. The coca trade was small, scattered, at first, but the Ochoa brothers saw its potential. Especially Jorge, who had the charm to court investors and the nerve to build bridges with smugglers. Fabio's role? Building the books, not the bombs. You don't get rich by luck. You stay rich by math. He never wore flashy gold chains. He never drove Lamborghinis. But he could tell you the fluctuating wholesale price of cocaine in Miami, down to the decimal, and how it differed from New York, Los Angeles, and Madrid. He could move $1 million across 5 countries and back before dinner and leave no trace. The Americans didn't understand him at first. The DEA had binders full of Escobar, helicopter photos, phone taps, explosions. But Fabio, he barely showed up. No fingerprints, no guns, no bravado, just business. You don't arrest spreadsheets, but you should have seen the look in his eyes when someone forgot to balance a shipment against the cash. that soft-spoken fury, that glacial patience. One time, a lieutenant came to him boasting about a quick deal that turned an extra 10 grand. Fabio paused, glanced at the ledger, and said, "Quick money always leaves a stain. Wash it before I see it again." That's when they knew. Fabio didn't shout because he didn't need to. Still, he wasn't just a back-office accountant. He met with financiers. He sat with cartel envoys from Mexico, Spain, Panama. He knew how to read a face, how to say nothing and still make his point. One story goes that an investor once tried to shortchange the Ochoas during a multi-ton shipment. Fabio walked into the meeting room, set a single calculator on the table, and said, "Let's check your math together." The room emptied in 10 minutes. No threats, no theatrics, just math and that eerie quiet that followed him wherever he went. One of the more surreal footnotes in his story comes in the form of a horse. Fabio entered one of his prized stallions into a national competition and won. Not just once, but repeatedly. The prize money was modest, but that wasn't the point. It was about image, poise, respect. It was about showing that he wasn't just a narco. He was a gentleman breeder with legitimate prestige, and it worked. Many in elite circles turned a blind eye to whispers. After all, Fabio paid his taxes, supported charities, attended Catholic Mass, sat in the front pew, silent, reverent, but don't mistake stillness for absence. As the empire grew, so did the complexity of its finances. Fabio built a shadow economy, offshore accounts, real estate investments, shell companies with names like Andina Investments Limited and Grupo Sol Caribe. It looked clean. It smelled clean. But it was soaked in drug dollars. The irony? He never touched cocaine. Didn't use it. Didn't party with it. To him, it was inventory. The kind you store, track, move, and monetize quietly, logically, and that was his genius. While the others made headlines, Fabio made systems. While the world chased the noise, he perfected the silence. 3 brothers, 1 legacy. The phrase would echo across Colombia's underworld for years, whispered with a mix of awe and suspicion. The Ochoa family, Juan David, Jorge Luis, and Fabio, formed the rarest kind of cartel leadership, one built on blood ties and business sense rather than brute violence. And at the quiet center of it all sat Fabio, the sibling most people wouldn't notice until it was far too late. Juan David was the firebrand, the elder brother who led with a commanding voice and a sharp glare. Jorge Luis, the middle man in action but the eldest in charm, carried the weight of diplomacy, smiling through deals and disarming rivals with grace. Fabio? He never needed to speak loudly, never needed to posture. His confidence wasn't in his chest. It was in his columns and margins. Many people still think that without Fabio, the Ochoa brothers would have stumbled into the same fate that met countless others. Gunned down, betrayed, or broken in courtrooms. But Fabio had a gift. He saw chaos coming 3 moves away, and he planned accordingly. The brothers grew up in a rural Antiochian household, infused with entrepreneurial spirit. Their father, Fabio Sr., was a well-respected horse breeder and businessman. The family wasn't poor. Far from it. But their rise to wealth was measured and slow, built on the back of legitimate work and long afternoons spent under the Colombian sun training Paso Fino horses. The connection to the land remained strong in all of them, but Fabio kept it with reverence. Even in the height of the cartel's power, he never shed his rancher's posture. He'd wake early, drink his coffee slowly, and walk the stables before touching a single number on his calculator. By the late 1970s, the cocaine industry had evolved from a fringe export to a booming black market economy. While many traffickers operated independently or in loose alliances, the Ochoa brothers saw the bigger picture. They envisioned an organized structure, less like a street gang and more like a multinational corporation. Pablo Escobar had the ambition to match that vision, but he lacked the structure. The Ochoas had it in spades, especially in Fabio. Their collaboration with Escobar became one of mutual benefit. Escobar needed access to trustworthy transportation and financial structure. The Ochoas needed product and expansion. The union gave birth to the Medellin cartel, a hydra of narco-capitalism with tendrils stretching from jungle airstrips to Miami nightclubs. Fabio never liked Escobar's theatrics. The gold-plated guns, the soccer fields, the self-proclaimed Robin Hood persona. It grated against his sense of order. He tolerated it because it worked, because the money flowed. But he always made sure his name stayed low, his involvement carefully veiled behind shell companies, offshore trusts, and legal entities that bore no obvious fingerprints. One former associate would later say, "If you had 10 million in cash, Fabio could turn it into a hotel, 2 horse ranches, and a bakery chain in 6 weeks. You'd never trace it back to the jungle." That was his magic and his shield. While Jorge Luis flew to Panama and Juan David oversaw shipping corridors, Fabio maintained meticulous records, and not just numbers. He documented behavior: who showed up late, who drank too much, who used product, who lied about weight or purity. His memory was prodigious, but he wrote everything down anyway. Encrypted, coded, locked. The real power, he believed, wasn't in wealth. It was in knowing where everything was, who had what, who owed whom, and who wouldn't be missed. It's said that once, when a supplier claimed they had delivered a full shipment but shaved off 20 kilos, Fabio didn't argue. He simply forwarded a ledger entry, noting the exact shortfall with interest. 2 days later, the full amount arrived, plus a bonus. No threats, just math and quiet correction. Yet many in the cartel feared Fabio more than the sicarios. With a sicario, you knew where you stood, life or death. With Fabio, the punishment was exile from the system. Your name erased, your cut canceled, your protection gone. No bullet, just silence. Inside the cartel's structure, Fabio's office was oddly serene. A cool room, white walls, dark wooden desk, and always fresh paper stacked neatly beside his pens. No guns, no trophies, just the hum of an adding machine and the occasional chirp of birds outside the window. That's where the deals were made, not on jungle airstrips or in smoky bars, but in the crisp silence of Fabio's domain. And he wasn't just good at hiding money. He was good at building walls around it. American investigators in the late 80s were stunned to find that dozens of legitimate businesses, everything from leather goods to telecommunications, were tied to Ochoa-affiliated ventures, all with above-board tax filings and zero criminal associations. Fabio's genius lay not in cooking the books, but in writing entirely new books no one knew existed. There was one moment, quietly famous among DEA case files, when an informant described meeting Fabio. "He shook my hand like a banker," the man said. "Then he asked me what kind of return I expected. I forgot we were talking about cocaine." By this time, the Medellin cartel was generating hundreds of millions annually, and much of that profit was routed through Fabio's systems. Yet he remained invisible. The press didn't talk about him. The authorities had photos of Jorge Luis, endless intel on Escobar, but Fabio was still a ghost, a name on a deed, a whisper behind a Cayman Islands company. That invisibility was strategic. He refused interviews, refused opulence. He had luxury, yes, but not flamboyance. A perfectly tailored suit, not a Versace silk. A vintage Rolex, not a diamond-studded monstrosity. And always, always, behind a locked door unless absolutely necessary. At family gatherings, it was Jorge Luis who poured the wine, Juan David who told the jokes, and Fabio who cleared the plates and asked about your retirement account. It sounds quaint, but it was intentional. He cultivated humility, like a vineyard. Some historians argue this very demeanor is what allowed him to operate for so long. Fabio wasn't ignored. He was overlooked, and that difference kept him breathing when others were bleeding. Still, there were moments when his mask slipped, like the time a mid-level lieutenant was skimming from one of the dummy corporations. Fabio didn't raise his voice. He handed the man an envelope with one final paycheck and said, "You're paid. You're done. Don't call us again." The man disappeared, not killed, just gone. Like a file deleted, unrecoverable. No record, no revenge, just removal. It was this quiet, procedural ruthlessness that made Fabio invaluable. He wasn't there to enforce fear. He was there to enforce function. Long before the glint of cocaine glimmered in export containers or danced along Miami countertops, there were horses. Sleek, high-stepping Paso Finos with names like Majestuoso and Reina del Sur. And for Fabio Ochoa Vásquez, those horses were more than a hobby. They were his sanctuary, his origin story, and his first real education in value, patience, and prestige. As a boy, Fabio could spend entire afternoons grooming a single mare, brushing her mane until it glowed under the Antiochian sun. His brothers would call out for lunch or sneak off to flirt with neighbors, but Fabio stayed, lost in rhythm and precision. The stable was his church, the saddle, his pulpit. Their father, Don Fabio Sr., ran a respected breeding program. Not flashy, but solid. His ranch turned out some of the best show horses in the country, and from an early age, he taught his sons that winning wasn't just about strength, it was about gait, posture, and discipline. Fabio listened closely, more closely than anyone expected. Many people still think that Fabio's early mastery of horse breeding helped shape the obsessive rigor he would later apply to financial structures. The attention to lineage, the scheduling of feed cycles, the balancing of genetics and presentation. It wasn't so different from what he'd later do with offshore accounts and real estate trusts. He wasn't the most social rider at horse shows. While Jorge charmed the crowd and Juan David made bold bets on bloodlines, Fabio lingered at the edge of the arena, taking mental notes, reading not just the animals, but the handlers, who rushed, who cut corners, who tried to cheat the clock. He saw everything. One quiet afternoon in 1974, he surprised even his father by selling a foal before it was born, negotiated purely on the sire and dam's records. The buyer never saw the horse, never doubted the deal. Fabio handed over a contract typed and signed, and just like that, a new reputation was born. Not as a breeder, but as a man whose word could carry value even before the product existed. That same year, he began applying similar precision to the family's other ventures. The Ochoas had dabbled in shipping, agriculture, and modest land development. Fabio began organizing those ventures under an internal system of ledgers that made tax filings faster and payroll cleaner. He even convinced a skeptical uncle to switch from handwritten receipts to carbon copy invoice books. It was simple, but revolutionary. By 1978, whispers of new opportunities drifted into their Antiochian circle. Cocaine, then mostly processed in small jungle labs and smuggled north in suitcases, was gaining traction. The margins were irresistible. For every $1,000 invested in coca paste and transport, a trafficker could expect $30,000, $50,000 in return once it hit U.S. streets. The math wasn't subtle. Jorge Luis was the first to lean into the idea. Juan David followed soon after, drawn by the challenge of infrastructure. But Fabio? He hesitated. Not for moral reasons. Morality was already a blurred sketch among landowners and middlemen in the region. But because it looked messy, he'd seen the chaos of smuggling. The desperate dealers, the paranoid couriers, the quick deaths. It was emotional, unstable, reactive. Fabio liked order. If he was going to get involved, it had to be professionalized. And so he offered a condition. If the brothers were to invest in trafficking, Fabio would only participate if he could manage the funds his way, with a long-term strategy. No suitcases full of wet dollars, no unrecorded exchanges. He proposed the creation of holding companies and capital vehicles that could absorb money like a sponge and squeeze it out clean through shell contracts, land purchases, and legitimate businesses. At first, even his own family balked. You want to use the tools of the banks to launder drug money? Jorge had laughed. Fabio didn't. No, he said softly. I want to use their tools to hide our empire in plain sight. The next year, they tried it his way. With just $1.2 million from a single shipment, Fabio created 3 front companies: a luxury construction firm in Bogota, a cattle feed co-op in Bucaramanga, and a tourism business on the coast. Each had bank accounts, payroll staff, and tax IDs. On paper, they employed over 200 people and generated monthly revenue. In reality, they were mechanisms, washers, pressure valves. The success was immediate and invisible. Where Escobar was buying mansions and zoo animals, the Ochoas were quietly acquiring influence. And Fabio, ever careful, ensured each venture appeared to pass muster under Colombian regulatory review. One of his dummy firms even won a regional award for economic development. The irony was so sharp it could cut marble. At no point did Fabio move product directly. He never scheduled shipments, never met with jungle chemists, never loaded a truck. His job was after the deal, when the weight was gone and the money needed direction. That's when he stepped in, calm as ever. A few keystrokes, a few calls, a few signed documents later, and the cash vanished into a global fog of holdings and wire transfers. Money, he understood, didn't need to move fast. It needed to move smart. Even as Medellin cartel violence escalated in the early 80s, Fabio remained untouched. His hands stayed clean. His horses still won prizes. His passport was rarely flagged. While American agents placed bounties on Escobar and tracked the movements of Jorge and Juan David, Fabio vacationed in Spain and Portugal, met with consultants, and opened accounts in Luxembourg. There's an unconfirmed story, scholars still debate its accuracy, about Fabio attending a financial conference in Geneva under an alias. Not to speak, just to observe. He took pages of notes on Swiss trust laws and cross-border tax treaties. When he returned, he revised all of their laundering procedures, and that's the kind of detail that sets him apart. Most traffickers aim to escape capture. Fabio aimed to disappear within legitimacy. He wasn't immune to pressure, though. The business scaled rapidly, and with it came risks. Greedy lieutenants, reckless partners, and the slow creep of notoriety. Every year, Fabio tightened the protocols, more layers, more filters, more distance between dollar and origin. Even family wasn't exempt. He once denied a cousin's request for investment funds, citing insufficient collateral despite the bloodline. "This isn't a favor bank," he told him. "It's a structure." By the time 1982 rolled around, Medellin was a global export force. U.S. officials estimate that up to 80% of the cocaine entering their country originated from Colombia, and the Ochoas were knee-deep in the upper echelons. Yet Fabio's name still didn't ring bells in the average DEA office, and that was by design. He would later be described by one Colombian journalist as the still lake at the foot of an exploding volcano. You might not notice him at first glance, but beneath that surface, whole systems churned with perfect, chilling grace. The blueprints for what would become one of the most efficient and terrifying criminal enterprises of the 20th century weren't drawn in back alleys or jungle camps. They were quietly mapped in ledgers and flowcharts, often over a black coffee in a room where the curtains were always drawn. And in the center of that quiet, systematic planning stood Fabio Ochoa Vásquez, never loud, never hurried, but always 5 steps ahead. The early 1980s were a time of aggressive expansion. The Medellin cartel was no longer a loose alliance of smugglers. It was a syndicate. And like any business scaling too fast, it risked collapse under its own weight. Too many shipments, too many partners, too many egos. Pablo Escobar had dreams of national power. Jorge Luis was courting politicians. Juan David was coordinating exports through Central America. But Fabio was building structure. He didn't want chaos disguised as growth. He wanted a plan, so he drew one. Using the model of multinational corporations, Fabio designed a shadow architecture. Every arm of the cartel, from production to distribution to investment, was assigned a chain of responsibility, buffers, and reporting protocols. A cocaine shipment from the Andes to Miami would pass through a dozen entities, each one a separate cell. If one cell was compromised, the others remained insulated. It was compartmentalization, corporate style. Many people still think that had Fabio not stepped in during this stage, the Medellin operation would have imploded from internal conflict long before law enforcement ever got close. His system kept reckless ambition in check, turning a criminal network into something dangerously close to a functioning enterprise. He even implemented audits, real ones. Cartel lieutenants were required to keep inventories, track routes, and justify losses. Fabio reviewed everything, and when a discrepancy appeared, he didn't threaten. He asked questions, calmly, repeatedly, until the lie unraveled like an old rug. Most traffickers feared exposure. Fabio feared inefficiency. One of his most ingenious innovations came in the form of ghost shipments, false loads that never existed but appeared in records to explain revenue. If a front company showed profits too high for its operations, a ghost shipment would account for the discrepancy. And if someone ever came asking, the shipment was lost at sea, convenient, plausible, unprovable. It wasn't long before people began referring to him as El Arquitecto, the architect, not for buildings, but for systems, invisible ones. His headquarters was modest, a 2-story villa on the outskirts of Medellin, whitewashed and surrounded by eucalyptus trees. No guards out front, no obvious signs of wealth. Inside, however, it was a temple of precision. Climate-controlled storage for documents, encrypted filing systems, and a rotating staff of vetted accountants and lawyers, many of whom didn't know exactly who they worked for. He once told a visiting partner, "Every dollar has a footprint. My job is to make it walk in circles until it forgets where it started." That same partner later recalled the meeting in hushed tones to a journalist. There were no threats, no cocaine, no guns, just balance sheets. I left more terrified than if I'd walked through Escobar's zoo. Fabio's methods extended beyond the business. He demanded that even personal expenditures by cartel members be justified. Lavish purchases were liabilities. He encouraged investments in quiet assets, farmland, telecommunications, clinics, logistics firms. The goal wasn't just wealth, it was permanence. While Escobar threw money into building neighborhoods and bombing politicians, Fabio kept investing in silence, in absence, and it worked. By 1983, the Medellin cartel had a revenue stream that rivaled some Latin American governments. U.S. intelligence estimated weekly earnings of up to $60 million. Planes flew out of hidden airstrips daily. Submarines were being discussed. The whole operation pulsed like a living machine, and Fabio monitored its heartbeat. Of course, Escobar's ambition didn't come without its dangers. He entered politics, built soccer stadiums, and began to believe his own mythology. Fabio watched this from a distance, expression unreadable. There was a story, shared quietly among insiders, of a dinner in 1984 at Hacienda Nápoles. Escobar toasted to the empire we've built. Jorge Luis raised his glass. Juan David smirked. Fabio set his glass down untouched and simply asked, "For how long?" The room fell quiet. Escobar didn't like questions, but he didn't challenge Fabio either. That was his power. Many law enforcement agencies struggled to understand how someone so central to the cartel's inner workings left such a faint trail. Fabio's name appeared in only a handful of declassified U.S. documents before the mid-'80s. He didn't attend high-risk meetings. He never used a traceable phone. And every business in his name was clean, on paper at least. His mastery of front structures extended internationally. He opened import-export firms in the Netherlands, partnered with shipping routes through Panama, and maintained accounts in the Cayman Islands under nominee directors. Lawyers who handled his paperwork often believed they were representing a European logistics magnate. One even asked if Fabio was in aviation. He smiled. "In a way," he said. And then there was the mirror method. For every dirty transaction, Fabio ensured there was a clean counterpart, one that could be shown, verified, and explained. If one account received cartel money, another mirrored it with a documented business deal. The two danced in sync, making audits look seamless. Scholars still debate the sophistication of these tactics. Some say Fabio invented them. Others believe he borrowed heavily from old mafia methods and updated them with modern tools. So what do you think? Was he a criminal genius or just an excellent student of shadow economies? Whatever the case, his systems endured. And then there were the white lists, internal documents maintained by Fabio that tracked who was safe to deal with and who was not. Politicians, military officers, customs agents, even journalists. Each name had a color rating. Green meant reliable. Yellow meant watch. Red meant cut ties or take action. He never spoke openly of these lists. But when a bribe was rejected or a contact turned suddenly cold, Fabio would make a call. One sentence. Move them to yellow. Nothing more. By 1985, his influence within the cartel had become unspoken but absolute. No shipment moved without passing through a framework he'd approved. No laundering scheme ran without his algorithm. And yet, he remained a mystery to even some of his closest allies. One DEA analyst, years later, described the cartel's inner hierarchy as a noisy play with one quiet director sitting in the back row. Fabio didn't need the spotlight. He designed the stage in a world where men shouted their power through gold chains, assault rifles, and convoys of armored SUVs. Fabio Ochoa Vásquez preferred rooms where the loudest sound was the scratch of a fountain pen on parchment. By 1985, the Medellin cartel had fully erupted into global infamy. Airports tightened protocols. U.S. task forces doubled. Politicians gave fiery speeches. And yet, inside one white-walled room on the Ochoa estate, Fabio calmly reviewed a balance sheet that listed 15 dummy corporations under 5 countries, each with accounts, suppliers, and quarterly projections. The paper smelled of ink and cedar. His desk was spotless. He didn't need the theatrics. He had clarity. The irony of his position wasn't lost on anyone who knew him well. While men like Escobar blasted their presence onto the front page, Fabio remained in the margins. But in those margins, he wrote code. Not digital, financial. And for those within the operation, it was the only language that mattered. One courier once remarked, "If you knew Fabio signed off on your payout, you'd sleep well. If you hadn't seen his signature yet, even a briefcase full of cash didn't feel real." His approval wasn't a blessing. It was confirmation that the system still ran and you were still part of it. At this point, Fabio's scope went beyond laundering. He began shaping the cartel's international strategy. Instead of just hiding money, he built funnels, tunnels of clean investment that allowed the dirty cash to be absorbed into banks, construction projects, and logistics firms. And he did it without leaving Colombia. He had trusted emissaries, some lawyers, some brokers, some who never knew who their real boss was, operating in Miami, Zurich, São Paulo. They received directives so precise, so clinically phrased, that even under scrutiny they resembled corporate memos. One such agent reportedly asked, "Is this from a company or a government?" The reply? Yes, Fabio didn't invent shell corporations, but he elevated them to an art form. His entities were so layered, so buried beneath other names and jurisdictions, that even when one was exposed, it took months to decipher its true ownership. And by then, the funds were already rerouted. Many people still think that without Fabio's innovations, the Medellin cartel's financial wing would have collapsed under basic audits. He was the scaffolding, the quiet force that let the chaos above dance unafraid. This was the era when Escobar was building his own prison, known as La Catedral, filled with jacuzzis and parakeets. Fabio, meanwhile, was building a foundation that didn't need walls. His power came from comprehension. He saw the whole map when others only saw dots, and yet he remained oddly grounded. The family ranch continued to operate. Horses were bred, shown, sold. Fabio still insisted on daily walks through the stables when he wasn't working. There's something gently surreal in the idea. A man laundering hundreds of millions, pausing mid-call to check a stallion's feed mixture. Still, he knew danger was circling, not from rival gangs, but from within. The cartel had grown too large, too layered. New players joined the network, each more eager, more reckless. Fabio began instituting risk thresholds. Certain shipments, if deemed too visible or likely to draw attention, were denied funding. One trafficker once tried to override him, claiming Jorge Luis had already approved. Fabio replied, "Then Jorge can also account for the investigation. The shipment never left the port." He wasn't trying to kill the empire. He was trying to slow its fall. In those same years, the DEA launched aggressive campaigns across Latin America. Radar tracking improved. Undercover stings increased. Informants multiplied. Fabio, ever calm, responded not with panic, but with refinement. He updated protocols, shortened exposure windows, converted cash-based fronts to hybrid credit models to avoid cash seizures. In a world obsessed with speed, he emphasized timing. There's an old saying, "Speed kills, precision survives." It might as well have been his motto. And then came the infamous internal split, the one scholars still dissect in political science courses. Escobar, increasingly paranoid, began isolating himself. He distrusted meetings, micromanaged shipments, and demanded loyalty oaths. Fabio saw what was coming. He called it vertical collapse, a tower falling inward from a brittle core. He began quietly detaching the Ochoa operations from Escobar's control. Not overtly, just minor reassignments of accounts, shifts in transport networks, whispers to contacts about going independent. One of his quietest moves was also one of his most significant. In early 1987, he authorized the creation of a European logistics firm under the name Isla Negra Holdings. On paper, it specialized in maritime freight. In reality, it was a cash migration tool. Over 18 months, Fabio funneled nearly $300 million through its accounts, repackaged as shipping revenue. Authorities never caught it. Even now, investigators say they suspect where the money went, but the paper trail dissolves after Amsterdam. What's astonishing is that Fabio wasn't driven by greed. He already had more money than he could ever spend. His actions were about insulation, building so many layers of safety that even collapse couldn't reach him. That's what makes his style so chilling. It wasn't personal. It wasn't even criminal in the way we picture it. It was procedural. A math equation written in shadows. By the late 80s, his influence touched everything. When a new batch of recruits entered the cartel's logistics wing, they received not training in smuggling, but a 72-page operations manual authored by Fabio. It included sections like optimal asset distribution and signal interruption contingencies. Someone joked it looked like an MBA syllabus. It wasn't a joke for long. A former U.S. Treasury agent once admitted, "We had Ivy League grads studying his laundering trails. Some couldn't replicate them." That's how refined his system was. And yet, even as law enforcement tightened its grip, Fabio never flinched. When a major raid disrupted a supply line in Venezuela, he simply rerouted through Suriname without hesitation. To him, risk wasn't failure. It was fluctuation, a variable to solve. He began keeping dual ledgers, one for internal cartel review, one for personal use. The second ledger, only seen by 3 people in his lifetime, reportedly included predictions, estimates of government response times, arrest probabilities, even likelihood of betrayal within each tier. He updated it monthly. That wasn't paranoia, that was preparation. One day, during a tense conversation with a Miami-based accountant who warned of imminent indictments, Fabio leaned back and said, "The difference between fire and light is control. Let's stay luminous," and that perhaps defines him best. Not a flame, not a shout, just a glow, steady and strategic, behind every wall of Medellin's underworld. Hacienda Nápoles was many things to many people. To some, it was a playground of opulence. Hippos imported from Africa, private airstrips, fountains shaped like cocaine bricks. To others, it was a fortress where drug lords plotted routes, placed orders, and flexed their growing influence across hemispheres. But for Fabio Ochoa Vásquez, the estate was something different. It was an illusion, while others reveled in its extravagance. Fabio often walked its manicured paths with a distant gaze, as if he could already see the cracks forming beneath the surface. He had never been interested in monuments to power. Power, in his mind, wasn't supposed to be seen. It was supposed to be unmistakable, even in absence. Many people still think that Fabio hated Hacienda Napolis, not because it was a symbol of excess, but because it made the operation visible. And visibility, to Fabio, was danger. The estate's opulence drew not only envy, but scrutiny. Local children played on the grounds. Politicians toured the zoo. Reporters tried to sneak photos. Meanwhile, helicopters hovered and satellite cameras clicked. Every inch of it said, "Come find us." So Fabio did what he always did. He adapted. Instead of trying to shut down the spectacle, he created distance from it. While Jorge Luis played host and Juan David negotiated with guests, Fabio stayed in the background, holding meetings in a separate guest house known internally as the Ledger Room. There were no murals, no music, no velvet curtains, just a long oak table, a safe, and 2 chairs. That's where decisions happened. He made a rule. No firearms inside the room, no raised voices, no alcohol. If someone broke a rule, they didn't get reprimanded. They just didn't get invited back. That was punishment enough. One night, when a young cartel courier stumbled in drunk and demanded a loan to start his own side hustle, Fabio didn't blink. He waited for the man to finish slurring, then handed him a napkin. On it was a single number, 0.00. The message was clear. The man was quietly reassigned within a week. The ranch operated on ceremony. Fabio operated on consequence. Still, he couldn't avoid the spectacle forever. As the cartel grew, so did the attention. U.S. pressure on Colombia's government intensified. Names were named, faces were posted. The Ochoas were now firmly in the public eye. Yet somehow, even as his brothers' faces appeared in international media, Fabio remained elusive. A 1986 Miami Herald expose titled "The Cocaine Kings of Colombia" featured Escobar, Gacha, Jorge Luis, but made only a passing reference to a third Ochoa brother, less visible, rumored to manage accounts. That line became a myth in itself. Scholars debate how Fabio pulled off this disappearing act. Some say he bribed officials to suppress his name. Others believe he constructed an elaborate network of aliases, even using doppelgangers to appear at business meetings. But those who knew him best say the truth was simpler. He didn't go where he didn't need to be. He avoided cameras, never raised his voice, never gave the story a hook. It was in this period that Fabio deepened his relationship with legitimate institutions. He began attending board meetings of regional business groups, quietly. He donated to hospitals, supported a Catholic seminary, even backed a local initiative to pave rural roads, all under company names, of course. To the average observer, he was just a rancher with a head for logistics and a passion for Paso Finos. He played the role so well, in fact, that a Bogota banker once invited him to speak on a panel about emerging markets and rural development. Fabio declined, politely, but behind the scenes, he was drawing his most intricate web yet. As cartel operations expanded into the Caribbean, Fabio saw opportunity in the banking loopholes of offshore jurisdictions. The Bahamas, Panama, Liechtenstein. Each country had its own quirks, its own backdoors. Fabio studied them like a scholar, and when the time came, he moved swiftly. He created trust companies with layers so thick that even modern forensic accountants struggle to untangle them. Assets were moved in packages, property in the Dominican Republic, offset by consulting fees from a Swiss firm that didn't really exist. Then came shell purchases, art, antiques, yachts, agricultural commodities, all used as vehicles for laundering. At one point, Fabio reportedly purchased over 24 refrigerated trucks under a company name registered in Chile. Not to move cocaine, but to move fish. Yes, actual fish. The trucks were used to justify fuel purchases and border crossings, masking entirely unrelated shipments. It was such a brilliant distraction that one customs official later said, "We spent 6 months chasing tuna. He didn't just hide money, he recycled it, folding it back into the global economy through trade, infrastructure, and tourism." Meanwhile, the violence raged on. Escobar declared war on the state. Bombings became common. Judges were assassinated. Planes were blown out of the sky. Fabio watched from his compound, the blue flame of a lighter catching his eye as he lit another filtered cigarette. He didn't smoke often, only when deep in thought. It was during this era that he began journaling, something only discovered much later. In a private notebook, he wrote down brief, almost poetic fragments. "Pablo's rage costs us $4 million this week. The U.S. Embassy's lights stay on past midnight. Nervous bureaucrats. Today, a horse died. I remember simpler deaths. These weren't records. They were reflections, and they reveal something few expected." He knew the end was coming. He began preparing. He tightened the laundering circuits. He stopped attending social events, even internal ones. He liquidated certain accounts and restructured trusts under more obscure jurisdictions. One by one, he folded his presence into shadow. It wasn't retreat, it was insulation. When the Colombian government, under increasing U.S. pressure, began negotiating surrenders in 1990, Fabio was already ready. His brothers debated, argued, circled. Fabio had already drafted his surrender proposal, complete with immunity terms and a suggested timeline. The contrast was stark. While others panicked, he packaged his exit like a quarterly report. But even then, there were rules. He demanded that his properties remain untouched, that his family retain control of legitimate businesses, that his sentence, if any, be served in Colombia, not the United States. The government balked. Fabio didn't flinch. "I've accounted for war," he reportedly said during a private meeting. "I'm offering peace at a discount." He always had a way with phrasing. The Americans had started circling. You could feel it in the news cycles. Sharp words from Washington, sanctions, secret memos with titles like Operation Kingpin and Financial Firebreak. By the early 1990s, the DEA had grown frustrated. They knew the money moved, and they knew it moved quietly. But they couldn't find the fingerprints. Not his fingerprints. Fabio Ochoa Vásquez remained an enigma, and yet, behind the scenes, his name had begun appearing more frequently on sealed indictments, in financial intelligence reports, in intercepted whispers between field agents. He wasn't untouchable. He was untraceable, which to some in the DEA was even worse. Many people still think that Fabio was underestimated for too long. Not because he wasn't dangerous, but because he never looked like danger. He looked like an accountant from Medellin, with pressed shirts and a preoccupation with horse feed. A man with no alias, no obvious vice, no violent record. But as one federal agent later said, he didn't need to shoot you. He could just cancel your income stream. The Ochoa family had already begun to shift strategy. The war Escobar had dragged them into, against the Colombian state, against the Americans, against reason, was unraveling everything they had built. Fabio had warned them for years, and now reality was catching up, so he did what he always did. He pivoted. Rather than dig in, he suggested a negotiated surrender, not just for himself, but for the family. If they could protect their assets, minimize jail time, and insulate their legitimate businesses, They could walk away bruised, but breathing. Jorge Luis was skeptical. Juan David was furious. But Fabio already had the draft terms in a briefcase. This wasn't cowardice. This was control. He didn't see surrender as defeat. He saw it as restructuring. And so the quiet choreography began. Meetings with intermediaries. Lawyers flown in under tourist visas. Discreet conversations with government liaisons who'd once attended the same charity fundraisers. Everything folded into calm preparation. Even in his legal troubles, Fabio moved like a man ironing his shirt. Slow, methodical, precise. There's a scene, whispered about in cartel circles, where Fabio met privately with 2 Colombian negotiators in a ranch guest house. No bodyguards, no brothers, just coffee, a manila folder, and a calculator. He didn't argue. He showed math. This is what you can seize. This is what will vanish if you do, he said. I'm offering you a better outcome than you think you'll get. They took the deal. Of course, the Americans didn't like it. They wanted him in a jumpsuit. They wanted him in Miami. But Colombia wasn't ready to hand him over. Not yet. So, in 1991, Fabio voluntarily surrendered to Colombian authorities under terms that stunned foreign observers. He was given a sentence. He would serve time. But his assets, his businesses, largely untouched, and perhaps even more unsettling to prosecutors. Fabio walked into prison alone, wearing a navy blazer and carrying nothing but a leather-bound planner. No outbursts, no press conference, just a nod and a quiet, "Let's begin." The prison itself, La Modelo in Bogota, was no luxury retreat. But for Fabio, it was insulation. He kept his schedule, wrote letters, reviewed paperwork. There were rumors he continued to advise businesses through intermediaries. Nothing could ever be proven. Of course, one prison official noted, he was polite, never raised his voice. You'd forget he was there, until you realized your financial records were somehow more organized after he'd read them. And while the world outside spiraled, Escobar's death in 1993, the disintegration of Medellin's power, the rise of Cali, Fabio stayed silent, observing, waiting. He didn't give interviews. He didn't brag. He made no public statements of regret or defiance. His lawyers said what little needed to be said. And behind the curtain, rumors swirled. That he was brokering deals from his cell. That his surrender had only been partial. That some of his money had never entered the spotlight at all. In U.S. circles, this infuriated many. DEA agents lobbied for extradition. Treasury officials tried to track the funds, but every trail turned to mist. Fabio had buried his financial architecture too well, too deep. No single account held the treasure. No single name held the power. It was all spread, deliberately, geometrically, brilliantly. One document, later declassified, shows a senior U.S. official writing, "We have nothing specific to charge him with that would stick." He designed the castle, then disappeared into its walls, still pressure-mounted. By the mid-90s, the mood had shifted. The U.S. wasn't content with partial justice. They wanted a message. And eventually, Colombian cooperation increased. It became clear that Fabio's name would resurface on an extradition list. He knew it, and he didn't fight it. That's what startled observers the most. When the extradition order came through, Fabio didn't run. He didn't appeal. He packed a single suitcase and surrendered himself again, this time for a flight north. At the Bogota airport, a U.S. Marshal reportedly asked him, "You nervous?" Fabio looked up from his notepad and said, "I've been preparing for this flight for 12 years, and then he boarded. In Florida, his case became a quiet storm. No television cameras, no grand jury dramas, just sealed documents, courtrooms with drawn blinds, and lawyers who walked out looking unusually tired. Fabio pled not guilty to multiple charges of drug trafficking, conspiracy, and money laundering. And yet, his demeanor didn't shift. He attended hearings in tailored suits. He nodded politely. He offered no outbursts, no spectacle. He requested paper and a desk to take notes, and while the courtroom drama swirled, so did the theories. Was he hiding something deeper? Was this surrender another strategic move, one that shielded family, finances, and future earnings under layers even prosecutors couldn't guess at? Many still argue that his extradition wasn't a loss. It was a reset. So what do you think? Did Fabio finally face justice, or did he turn even this into an asset? One former prosecutor later admitted, "We were trying to hold water in our hands. No matter how tight we squeezed, it slipped away." And behind it all, Fabio remained composed, just as he had been during his brother's parties, the hacienda feasts, the jungle contracts, the midnight ledgers, always the stillest man in the room. As the gavel struck and the courtroom murmurs faded, Fabio Ochoa Vásquez was led down a corridor of fluorescent light, another number in the federal system, another high-profile defendant in a suit tailored just slightly too well. But unlike others who came before or after him, Fabio's power didn't drain at the courthouse steps. It only adjusted. He was remanded to a federal detention center in Florida while awaiting trial. The American prison system was colder than La Modelo, figuratively and literally. There were fewer handshakes, no unspoken pacts. The walls were more sterile, the rhythms unfamiliar. But Fabio, he adapted the way he always did, quietly, surgically. Many people still think that this was his most dangerous phase, not because he was orchestrating operations from inside, but because he wasn't. His stillness during incarceration only fueled speculation that someone else was pulling strings in his name, that his empire no longer needed him to function. A man who had made himself obsolete by design. That's the kind of ghost that haunts prosecutors. His demeanor never changed. Every day, Fabio requested a pencil, a yellow legal pad, and exactly one newspaper. He read slowly, annotating margins. He exercised modestly. He spoke little. The staff nicknamed him El Banquero, the banker. Not because of his charges, but because he carried himself like a man who'd never been touched by dust. While other inmates formed alliances or submitted to prison cliques, Fabio remained untethered. He received visitors, mostly lawyers, one or two distant cousins, and passed messages through legal paperwork. Always above board, always respectable. At least on the surface, some guards swore he never slept. One night, a corrections officer walked past his cell at 2:43 a.m. and saw Fabio standing, fully dressed, reading a report by the light of his desk lamp. When asked the next morning if he was okay, Fabio simply replied, "Just reviewing the week." It became clear that his incarceration wasn't a pause. It was a calculation. At trial, the prosecution laid out its case: trafficking, laundering, conspiracy. They had testimonies, wiretaps, flight logs, but what they lacked was him. Fabio never appeared in a single photograph loading a plane. No calls with coded phrases, no emails, no wild purchases. He was too clean. His lawyers argued that he was merely a businessman caught in a net too wide, that his family name bore weight unfairly, that his financial genius was applied to legal enterprises, that the connections were circumstantial. And to the surprise of many, some jurors listened. He wasn't acquitted, but he wasn't buried either. In 2003, Fabio Ochoa Vásquez was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. A heavy sentence, unless you considered the scale of what he may have built, unless you considered that he'd voluntarily walked into it. No appeals, no speeches, no second act at the microphone. Just a nod, and then a walk down the hallway. Back in Colombia, the media reaction was mixed. Some saw the sentence as a victory for justice. Others, particularly those who'd lost family to cartel violence, called it insufficient. But the financial world, the quiet men who read between headlines, knew better. One analyst whispered, 30 years in prison is cheap for someone who built a structure that still works without him. It's around this time that the stories began. Not confessions, not memoirs, just theories that some of the trusts Fabio built were designed to mature decades later, that he'd created irrevocable financial vehicles set to activate after 20 years, that a portion of his wealth wasn't lost, but simply dormant, invested in mineral rights, offshore pensions, and EU land contracts under third-degree aliases. No hard evidence has surfaced. But in Panama, every few years, a journalist discovers a deed signed in 1989 by a company with ties to an Ochoa entity. It always seems just beyond reach. Inside prison, Fabio remained a curiosity. He never aligned with other Latin American inmates. He declined offers to participate in legal education programs. But once, in a quiet conversation with a Cuban detainee, he was asked if he missed the outside world. Fabio took a breath and replied, "No, I miss systems, the feeling of everything working at once." It wasn't a nostalgic answer. It was mechanical, like a clockmaker describing the hum of gears. And even within prison walls, he found his routines. He rose early. He read newspapers. He tracked global stock markets. He had a legal pad on which he charted oil prices and shipping indexes. Some inmates mocked him. Others watched with unease. A former inmate would later write, "The man never talked about drugs, not once. He talked about Argentina's currency crisis, Brazilian soybean tariffs, and the futures market. We weren't even sure he was in the right prison." That's the legacy Fabio crafted. Not just a life, but a design. Something you could almost step into. Like architecture. You could feel it pressing against the world's surface, shaping how shadows bent. His correspondence was just as precise. Every letter to his lawyers was typed, every clause clearly numbered. He offered no emotion, only logic. And then something curious happened. Around 2010, two of the shell companies linked, however distantly, to Ochoa family investments began showing unusual profit spikes. Not illegal, just unexpected. A cattle firm in Paraguay, a logistics startup in Morocco, both showing sudden gains, both with management tied to old Medellin-era names. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe they were maturing. Many people still wonder, was this Fabio's real design? To create a web that would wait, outlast investigations, outlive memory, and then re-emerge when the dust had truly settled. So what do you think? Was he serving time, or simply waiting for the compound interest of silence? Even his prison record reflected minimal infractions. No incidents, no disputes. One guard claimed he once asked for a replacement mattress, not because it was damaged, but because it squeaked when he turned over and disrupted his sleep. "Order," the guard said. That's what the man worshipped. In 2015, rumors began circulating that Fabio was suffering from a minor illness. Nothing fatal, but enough to draw concern. But true to form, he denied media requests for updates. He never asked for special treatment, never asked for release. He simply continued, quietly. The man who had moved hundreds of millions, who had once made European financiers lean forward with curiosity, now walked laps in a concrete courtyard, counting steps just as he once counted currencies. And the world, it moved on. Cartels rose, cartels fell, narcos became Netflix scripts. But somewhere in a federal cell, the architect who built the old empire's most invisible wing remained, still, silent, and maybe even satisfied. Even as years passed behind concrete and steel, something about Fabio Ochoa Vásquez refused to dissolve. Unlike so many others who faded into the blur of incarceration, loud men turned quiet, fiery bosses reduced to whispers, Fabio retained his clarity, his outline, if you will, a man of margins, still framed in perfect proportion. By 2017, he had already spent well over a decade in U.S. federal custody. His name was rarely mentioned in headlines anymore. Even among those who followed narco history obsessively, Fabio was an afterthought, overshadowed by Pablo's fire, by Gotcha's bombs, by the rise of Sinaloa and the fall of Cali. But for those who truly studied structure, financial crime units, offshore analysts, and the rare investigative journalist still poking around in Swiss banking records, Fabio was still a mystery worth pursuing. The problem wasn't what they knew. It was what they couldn't prove. The paper trails always ended in ellipses, a holding company with no active directors, a vineyard in Portugal bought with cash in 1993, a family trust in the British Virgin Islands still showing quarterly disbursements to consultants, and always in the background silence. Many people still think Fabio's true genius was this. He didn't erase his footprints. He made them look like someone else's. Back in prison, the daily rhythm remained unchanged. Rise at 5:30. Coffee, black, if available. Newspaper review, half-hour walk. Correspondence, legal or otherwise. Reading, mostly in Spanish, but occasionally in English. Some inmates thought he was working on a book. Others joked he was just keeping tabs on global inflation rates, so he could scold the economy when he got out. Fabio rarely corrected them. He had a wry sense of humor, but only when it served him. He once told a correctional counselor that he didn't mind the food, as long as the carrots are symmetrical. His request for work inside the facility? Data entry. He didn't want to clean floors. He wanted spreadsheets. When asked why, he answered, "Because it's the closest thing to fresh air I'll find here." But outside his walls, rumors kept breathing. Reports from Panama hinted at reactivated accounts, old ones that had lain dormant for 20 years. A shipping firm connected to one of Fabio's long-defunct corporations suddenly filed for a port contract in Cartagena. Names that had once populated Medellin's upper ledger started reappearing, not as criminals, but as venture capitalists. No indictments followed, no charges, just the usual academic speculation and a few raised eyebrows in the Treasury Department. Meanwhile, the Ochoa family remained active in certain corners of Colombian society. Some cousins managed legitimate ranches, others had investments in local businesses. There was no open display of wealth, just continuation, quiet, methodical, and unremarkable, except to those who understood what it meant. And perhaps the most chilling sign that Fabio's systems hadn't died was this. No one tried to replace them. Cartels that rose in the vacuum of Medellin's fall focused on muscle. They were violent, erratic, loud. But few tried to replicate Fabio's architecture. It was too complex, too expensive, too clean. One former U.S. narcotics agent admitted in a podcast interview, "We never caught the full web. We got the spider. Maybe. But the web, that thing's still catching flies." Back in Florida, Fabio began declining visitors. Not rudely, just firmly. He said he wanted to avoid distraction. He was focused on long-term reconciliations. No one knew what that meant. Was it spiritual, legal, financial, emotional? He didn't elaborate. He began requesting books on theology. Not flashy bestsellers, but dense texts on Jesuit ethics, monastic accounting traditions, and the moral philosophy of Aquinas. When asked if he was finding God, Fabio chuckled and replied, "No. Just studying how men once tried to quantify sin. That's the thing about him. He never tried to appear innocent, just unreadable." And then came a rare anomaly, a letter. In 2019, an investigative journalist working on a feature about the Ochoa family received a typed envelope. No return address. Postmarked from Miami. Inside was a single-page document. At the top, clarifications. It was unsigned, but those who'd met Fabio claimed the phrasing was unmistakable. You may call it crime, but it was only crime because it didn't fit your chart. We followed a structure. We paid debts. We stabilized regions. We knew what came in and what went out. The chaos you inherited after us is the real disorder. Don't mistake volume for sophistication. The journalist never published the letter. He said it made him feel like a footnote in someone else's spreadsheet. Still, the myth of Fabio persisted. So what do you think? Is it possible that a man can build something so perfectly insulated that even he becomes irrelevant to its continued function? A few experts believe so. By 2020, whispers began to emerge that Fabio had qualified for early release under compassionate grounds, health-related, likely tied to his age and medical condition. The paperwork was never made public. The Bureau of Prisons remained silent. No confirmation, no denial. But here's what's strange. Shortly after the rumor surfaced, a former customs official in Cartagena noticed that a dormant logistics company, Norte y Plata S.A., had filed a request to resume operations. The agent flagged the name as suspiciously historic, and then nothing happened. No follow-up, no investigation. The paperwork was clean, the owners legitimate. But the company's founding charter? Filed in 1986 by a now-dissolved Panamanian entity once linked to the Ochoa network. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe return. If Fabio was released, he didn't hold a press conference. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't appear on documentaries and shadowy interviews. He did what he always did. He disappeared on purpose. There's a man living on a small ranch in eastern Colombia who fits his age and description. He doesn't use a phone. He buys feed in cash. He speaks rarely and never about the past. The locals call him Don Fabio, with a V. Probably a coincidence, but someone once caught a glimpse of a notebook in the back of his truck. Inside, in small, careful handwriting, exchange rates, supply chain notes, and a line that read, "Risk is only chaos that hasn't been measured yet." No one's confirmed his identity. No one's tried too hard, because maybe no one wants to wake the system again. The name Fabio Ochoa Vásquez still echoed in certain circles, though often in whispers. Not in the mouths of street dealers or journalists anymore, but in the flat monotone of audit committee meetings, inside encrypted emails between South American law firms, or scribbled faintly into margin notes by interns at banks who didn't realize what, or who, they were brushing up against. To the world, Fabio had vanished. To systems, he was simply dormant. By the early 2020s, the financial landscape had changed dramatically. Cryptocurrencies had introduced a new era of laundering. Cartels grew more fragmented. Violence, once a byproduct of competition, became the business model itself. And yet, the enduring curiosity around Fabio came not from nostalgia, but from the strange durability of his footprintless design. Take, for example, the investment pattern of a shell company in Uruguay that suddenly bought land near Montevideo, land that, 30 years earlier, had once belonged to a trust managed by an Ochoa-linked accountant. The documents were all legal, all boring, and yet the dates lined up too neatly. Many people still think that Fabio created a timed escape, an architecture of trusts, land deals, and royalty contracts set to mature long after his arrest. And when these assets bloomed, they would feed a system that no longer needed his hand. If true, that means he wasn't just planning for release. He was planning for irrelevance. And here's the thing. Irrelevance was always his protection. Back in Colombia, the Ochoa family name no longer made headlines. Jorge Luis served his time, returned to a quiet ranching life. Juan David, too, had faded from the spotlight. Their sons and cousins branched into more orthodox business, agribusiness, local construction, hospitality. The family had become what it once only pretended to be. But when asked directly about Fabio, most relatives offered a slight pause. Then, he's doing well. Or, he enjoys his privacy. Never. He's here. And still, things moved quietly. A logistics corridor in northern Colombia suddenly reopened under a company with a curious lineage. A series of international freight investments aligned with former Ochoa-linked routes. Even a horse, bred under a newly registered ranch name in Santander, matched the precise lineage of a line Fabio had been curating in the 80s. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in systems designed by Fabio, coincidence rarely survived without approval. And meanwhile, the United States government still held files, hundreds, maybe thousands of pages, related to Ochoa Vásquez, F. Some were declassified. Most weren't. But those who've seen them say they include things that don't add up. Financial transfers never followed up, associates who disappeared from the radar, companies that folded and then reopened in entirely new jurisdictions. He never had a cell phone, never used a personal computer, never sent an email under his own name. And yet, his influence reached further than men who had walls of photos, satellite surveillance, and millions in bounties, because Fabio didn't rely on muscle. He relied on momentum. Even inside prison, he had once described his ideal operation as something that keeps moving even if no one pushes it. He didn't need to be El Chapo, with escapes and tunnels and Netflix specials. He didn't want to be remembered. He wanted his structure to be remembered, used even. Because if it was used, then he never really disappeared. He simply became foundational. So what do you do with a man like that? One government official described it this way. We couldn't convict him on who he was, only what we assumed he'd done. He was more theory than evidence, which begs the question, was Fabio Ochoa Vásquez a criminal or a designer of alternate economies? He never denied what the cartel did. He just never claimed part in the violence. That was someone else's department. He didn't instruct hits. He didn't smuggle kilos. But he did make it all possible. He made it move. And maybe that's why he was the only one who could walk away from it. After all, when Pablo Escobar died, he was barefoot on a rooftop. When Fabio disappeared, it was in a pressed shirt and a closed ledger. There's a town in the Andes where a man in his 70s buys newspaper clippings from the local stand, never speaks more than a sentence at a time, and spends most of his day feeding Paso Fino horses. The neighbors say he's gentle, keeps to himself, smart eyes, always watching. They say he doesn't use the internet, doesn't own a car, pays his feed supplier in bundles of old crisp pesos, always even denominations. They say his name isn't Fabio, but when he walks into the local supply store, the clerk often finds the receipts filed before he arrives. Tidy, exact, balanced, like someone already knew what would be needed and when. A whisper around town calls him El Silencio, the silence. One night, a visiting cousin from Bogota told a bartender, "That man used to run part of the world." The bartender shrugged. "He runs the cash drawer now." It's moments like these where you feel the pull of what Fabio always understood, that power doesn't need to roar. It doesn't even need to exist in the present tense. It just needs to last. So what do you think? Was Fabio just a man who knew when to leave the room? Or was he the room itself, quiet, locked, and still calculating? Because somewhere, right now, a trust is probably disbursing funds. A property is accruing interest. A spreadsheet is balancing in perfect silence. And if you trace the design carefully enough, you just might find the faintest signature, F. Ochoa V. When the DEA closed the last of its active cases connected to the Medellin cartel's financial operations, they wrote in their internal summary, "No further traceable transactions tied directly to Fabio Ochoa Vásquez at this time." It was a line that meant closure to some, resignation to others. But to those who'd studied Fabio's techniques, it felt less like an ending and more like the last sentence of a draft that had already been rewritten elsewhere. Quietly, cleanly. Because while Pablo's death marked an era's explosive conclusion, Fabio's fade was so subtle it almost escaped history. Almost. The truth is, nothing about him was accidental. His stillness was curated. His silence, not absence, but atmosphere. And his absence? An instruction. Back in the late 80s, Fabio once told a business partner, "If they can't remember your face, they can't recall your guilt." He wasn't being flippant. He was building doctrine, rule by omission. Many people still think that Fabio's real weapon wasn't money or knowledge. It was timing. He understood when to act, when to pull back, and, most importantly, when to stop. While others became addicted to power, expansion, or notoriety, he moved like a chess player satisfied to retreat a queen if it preserved the long game. So it's no surprise that in recent years, small anomalies began appearing in the financial world. Things that, individually, meant nothing. A land purchase in Ecuador by a Swiss nonprofit. A dormant holding company in Malta reactivating to acquire shares in a freight insurance startup. A BVI-registered trust disbursing dividends to a family agricultural firm in Colombia. Each event was too distant from the others. But to those who once followed Fabio's ledgers, they all bore his signature strategy: spread risk, rotate identity, and mature over time. And then came the document. In 2022, an anonymous leak surfaced, an internal audit report from a mid-sized Panamanian bank. Buried in the report was a line item for a client account flagged as inactive since 1995, but maintained per institutional instruction. The account had been opened by Primavera Global Holdings, a firm with no current directors and a mailbox address. Its founding paperwork, signed by a man named Francisco Vásquez Olmo. Not quite Fabio Ochoa Vásquez, but in the system Fabio designed, that's close enough. So what does this tell us? Perhaps nothing. Or perhaps that while others buried treasure, Fabio built vaults that opened on a timer. Back in Colombia, stories persisted. The man in the hills, the precise hay deliveries, the accountant with no past. A journalist once attempted to locate this figure, driving hours into the mountains to ask questions that locals didn't appreciate. They told him there was no Don Fabio, that he had moved away, that he had never been there, or that maybe he was always there, just not who they thought. The journalist gave up. But not before seeing a line of horses moving gracefully across a foggy ridge, led by a man in a pressed shirt and straw hat. When asked what the man looked like, the journalist said, "Like someone who had already done everything he needed to do." Meanwhile, financial records kept surfacing like bubbles from a sunken wreck. In Madrid, a small tech firm received an unexpected investment from an unnamed silent partner. In Bogotá, a legal firm specializing in inheritance law filed 3 unusual asset transfers connected to shell companies with structures nearly identical to those Fabio once used. Was it proof? Not by a long shot, but the shape of the silence felt familiar, and yet Fabio remained a ghost. Not the haunting kind, but the architectural kind, the one whose presence is felt in how the windows are aligned, how the floorboards don't creak, how the light falls perfectly across a page. Those who'd worked with him during the Medellin days rarely spoke of him, not out of fear, out of reverence. They described him the way one might describe a particularly effective storm. No wasted motion, no false thunder, just result. He never published the memoir, never sold his story, never tried to rehab his image. That silence? It wasn't retreat, it was policy. The last known photo of Fabio Ochoa Vásquez was taken in 1999 during his trial in Florida. He is seated, hands folded on the table, wearing a navy suit and a faint smile. Behind him, a blurred American flag. Before him, a document he would never sign. He's not tense. He's not evasive. He looks like a man who already knows how this ends, and maybe that's what set him apart from the rest. He didn't try to outgun the system. He outlasted it, not by hiding, but by never revealing more than necessary, never more than he was willing to lose. So what do you think? Is it possible for someone to remove themselves so completely from history that only their designs remain? If so, maybe Fabio Ochoa Vásquez is already gone. Not dead, just concluded. A closed bracket. A name you don't need to say anymore because the architecture around you still follows his blueprint. The money's not in the bank. The map's not on paper. The empire's not in ruins. It's just humming quietly, still working, still turning, still his. Years have a way of erasing noise and polishing myth. And in the case of Fabio Ochoa Vásquez, the noise was never really there to begin with. What remained was myth, quiet, architectural, eerily durable. By 2023, the Medellin cartel was more history book than headline. Netflix had dramatized its rise and fall. Podcasts debated Escobar's morality. Old safe houses became tourist stops. But Fabio? He stayed where he'd always been, between the lines. A former intelligence officer in Bogotá once remarked, "We've dissected every major player from that era, but the one we still talk about over coffee is Fabio, because his silence is the only thing we can't file away." And perhaps that's because what Fabio built was never really designed to end. It was designed to recede, to fall beneath the surface like cables under a city, still humming, still routing power, long after the towers above had fallen. Many people still think that Fabio's real triumph wasn't evasion, it was translation. He didn't just hide dirty money, he turned it into clean systems, ranches, clinics, water treatment startups, logistics routes. He converted one reality into another so convincingly that even today, you might walk into a cafe or rent a beachfront apartment and never know it was funded by something older, something buried, something Ochoa. And unlike Escobar, he never believed in permanence. He believed in motion. Back in prison, one of his rare cellmates told a journalist that Fabio once diagrammed a flowchart of a perfect laundering loop on the back of a napkin. "It was beautiful," the man said. "More like a sculpture than a crime." When asked what happened to the napkin, the inmate smiled. He took it, said it wasn't finished, That, too, was the essence of Fabio. Never done, just progressing. In the quiet hills of Colombia, there's a ranch that doesn't appear on most maps. It's not fenced off, no security cameras. The gate is wooden, hand-painted, with a faded sign that reads, Tres Pasos. Just 3 steps. Neighbors say the man who lives there is polite, reserved. He breeds horses, keeps meticulous records, buys oats in bulk, never haggles, always pays early. They say he attends church twice a month, donates anonymously to local schools, and has never once asked for Wi-Fi. No one's sure of his last name, and yet, every so often, a well-dressed visitor arrives from the city. They never stay long. They bring a file, or a briefcase, or sometimes just a sealed envelope. The man reads it, nods, hands them a list, or a receipt, or nothing at all. It's not dramatic. It's not cinematic. It's just procedural. There's a myth, half folklore, half whispered truth, that he keeps a single cabinet in his modest home. Inside, labeled folders, each one dated, some stretching back to the late 1970s, every sheet numbered, notebooks with tiny, perfect handwriting, as if someone had been tracking the past, present, and future all at once. Not for legacy, just for accuracy. No journalist has seen it. No law enforcement agency has found it, but a former aide from the Colombian Justice Ministry once said, if that cabinet exists, it's the Rosetta Stone of post-cartel Colombia. Still, no one goes looking. Why? Perhaps because some structures are better left standing, even if no one lives in them anymore, because they hold up more than people realize. And it's worth noting that Fabio never asked for mercy. He never claimed he was misunderstood. He never blamed his brothers, the system, the times. His only recorded comment to a prison official after sentencing was, everyone was measuring noise. I was measuring consequence. There's a lesson in that. It's 2024 now. The drug trade has changed. Cartels are digital. Cryptocurrencies are the new couriers. Wars are fought over social media, and the line between criminal and corporate has never been blurrier. But even now, in seminars on anti-money laundering, Fabio's name still floats, not in scandal, but in case studies. Students at universities in New York and London review fictional simulations of laundering operations and inevitably discover they're modeled after his methods. They ask, who designed this scenario? And the professor often smiles and replies, someone who saw the whole board. His legend doesn't need drama. It has diagrams. So what do you do with a story like this? You don't chase it. You don't wrap it up with a neat moral. You let it sit, like an unsent invoice, like a safe with no keyhole, like a whisper from a room where the lights were turned off decades ago. Because some men don't make exits. They leave systems. And if you're listening to this tonight, somewhere between waking and sleep, you might wonder, is he still out there? Maybe. Or maybe he's not out there at all. Maybe he's beneath it, quiet, layered, humming like an old machine that no one built a replacement for. A man whose empire never fell, because it never needed to rise. By now, even the investigators have stopped looking. Not because they found what they needed, but because what they're searching for no longer behaves like evidence. It behaves like legacy, like the faint current beneath still water. And legacy, as Fabio Ochoa Vásquez would have said, doesn't leave prints. It leaves patterns. In Bogotá's financial district, there's a mid-sized firm known for its discretion. It doesn't advertise. It doesn't sponsor football teams or host charity luncheons. But its quarterly reports are always flawless. Its clients, always protected. And every so often, its transactions cross paths with entities that trace, albeit through years and shell layers, back to Fabio's era. One young analyst there once remarked, "Sometimes I feel like I'm working inside someone else's script, like this was all set up decades ago, and I'm just following instructions I don't fully understand." He wasn't wrong. Fabio's systems weren't just made to move money. They were made to replicate themselves, like vines that find new walls to climb. All they need is time. Many people still think that if you truly wanted to measure Fabio's impact, you wouldn't look at arrests or extraditions. You'd look at real estate ledgers, at foundation charters, at trade corridors that shouldn't exist but do. Efficient, uninterrupted, eerily stable. You'd look at the spreadsheet that still balances without a hand. Let's revisit something simple. A name, Fabio Ochoa Vásquez. In most records, it's typed in uppercase. In DEA files, it's bolded. But in his own handwriting, those who've seen it say, it was always printed small, neat, lowercase. He never signed dramatically, just initials, just enough, because that's what mattered, just enough. He never built to impress, he built to last. And unlike his brothers, who often needed to be seen, heard, feared, Fabio required none of that. He required only one thing, continuity. Even his physical demeanor reflected that. Guards described him as deliberate. He never rushed, never slouched, never lingered. Every motion had a purpose, as though movement itself were a form of accounting, a balancing act, even in step. So what becomes of such a man when the world forgets him? He becomes something else, a formula, an absence that functions. There's a farm cooperative in Argentina. On paper, it's owned by a local family. But its supply routes, warehousing protocols, and export documentation mirror a model Fabio drafted in the 1980s for agricultural shell layering. When an auditor flagged the pattern in 2023, no action was taken. Why? Because nothing was illegal, just familiar. That's the brilliance of his structure. Compliance by mimicry. You don't hide the truth. You let the system become the truth. Back in the hills, if the stories are true, Fabio still walks each morning, slowly, deliberately, checking on horses that bear names no one recognizes, but that he could trace back 5 generations. That same precision, that same attention, now poured into animal care and fencing lines instead of shell mergers and forex arbitrage. But occasionally, according to rumor, he still meets with someone. Not weekly, not often, but once in a while, a visitor arrives carrying papers, always in a sealed folder, always exchanged quietly. He doesn't sign anything in public. He doesn't speak more than necessary. But when he returns to his home, they say, he sits at the same wooden table, opens a drawer, removes a ledger, and begins to write. Some say it's just a journal. Others say it's the ledger, his original one, the master document, still active. That's probably romanticism or paranoia, or maybe it's both. After all, a man like Fabio never needed to lie to become legend. He only needed to stop talking. What makes his myth so durable isn't scale, it's precision. The fact that even now, when investigators find a document they can't decipher, a structure they can't fully trace, or a payment that moves just a little too smoothly, someone inevitably mutters, "Could be one of Fabio's." His name has become shorthand for silent elegance, and as the decades tick forward, new players enter the scene. Young traffickers, flashy investors, digital pirates. They rise fast, burn hot, crash loudly, and beneath them, the quiet architecture Fabio left behind, unbothered, unblinking, untouched, because the system doesn't care who's loudest. It only cares who's correct. So what do you think? When he's gone, if he's not already, what will we say? Will we say he vanished? Or will we admit he never truly arrived in the way the others did? No gold chains, no mansions, no last stand, just calculations, just form. A ghost who never haunted because he never disturbed the balance. A man who didn't walk away from power. He walked into its quietest room and locked the door behind him. Time is a strange accountant. It tallies loudly for some. Names that scream from newspaper headlines, etched in court transcripts and splattered across history documentaries. And then there are others, like Fabio Ochoa Vásquez, whose record isn't written in ink but in patterns, not in spotlight, but in shadow. By 2025, the criminal landscape looks nothing like it did in Fabio's day. Today's cartels ride digital rails. Bitcoin replaces suitcases. Telegram groups take the place of jungle rendezvous. But underneath it all, there's still a need for structure, for systems that move funds invisibly, hold assets legally, and redirect risk like rivers around rock. And somewhere in the backbone of those systems, there are fingerprints that look an awful lot like his. There's a particular pattern that's become known to some forensic accountants as the Ochoa offset. It's not official, not in any manual, but it refers to a three-phase movement of capital involving a trust, a rural land transfer, and a boutique commodity, often livestock, coffee, or art. The result? Clean revenue over 5 fiscal years with no apparent illicit origin. The name Ochoa Offset came not from pride, from resignation, because no one could crack it fully, not without unraveling something much bigger. Fabio didn't invent laundering, but he gave it narrative. A beginning, middle, and end that mimicked legitimate capitalism so convincingly that even after 30 years, the script still works. Many people still think that he had help, that no single man could build so enduring a network. And perhaps that's true. But the point was never whether he did it alone. The point was that the system he created no longer required him. That was the genius. And the danger. Back in Colombia, whispers of his whereabouts come and go. A man in a straw hat at a livestock auction. A quiet donor at a veterinary school fundraiser. A polite gentleman who pays property tax 2 years in advance, and always in exact denominations. These stories vanish quickly, like the figures who tell them. A foreign journalist once flew to Medellin, trying to hunt down the last known photo of Fabio. He was told, gently but firmly, "You're chasing a chair after someone has stood up." A poetic way of saying, "You're too late. The man is gone." But the impression? That's still warm. In Miami, a former customs official noticed that several flagged transactions from the 1990s, long dormant in the financial crimes database, had quietly disappeared from active watch lists. Not deleted, not resolved, just archived. This, too, felt like something Fabio would design. A quiet burial, not of bodies, but of attention. One theory floated among retired DEA agents is that Fabio orchestrated his exit decades in advance, not just from prison or from criminal prosecution, but from history itself. That he'd slowly removed himself from his own system, the way a spider detaches from its web once it knows the strands will hold. And while that might sound romanticized, the evidence suggests otherwise. You don't survive this long, intact, untouched, and unnamed without intention. He never tried to be untouchable. He tried to be unnecessary. That was the exit strategy. But even exits leave echoes. In 2024, a small fintech startup in Spain received an angel investment from a quiet fund registered in Andorra. The money was clean, the paperwork flawless, but the name of the holding firm matched a known alias used by a former Ochoa associate in the 80s. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps Fabio's financial seedlings had reached bloom. This is the thing about structure. You don't see it until something breaks. And when nothing breaks, you start to forget it's there. Until one day, someone stumbles across an old document, or a payment without a sender, or a property that belongs to no one. And they remember. There was a man once, a man who built systems, a man who spoke little, but accounted for everything. And in that remembering, the myth tightens, because legends built on violence burn hot and fast. But legends built on function, on systems that still operate, those are the ones that last. So what do you do with a man whose greatest crime was clarity, who didn't need bodyguards or headlines, because he was never aiming to escape, only to vanish gracefully? You don't prosecute him, you study him in classrooms, in courtrooms, in quietly worded memos passed between compliance officers at multinational banks. Fabio's name doesn't roar anymore, it informs. A whisper passed between people who know how the world actually turns. A code, a case study, a warning, a model. In the end, there's no final shot, no dramatic collapse. Just a man who got smaller and smaller on the horizon until no one could say for certain whether he disappeared or simply receded into design. That's the way he wanted it. So what do you think? Does silence mean surrender, or does it mean success? Because somewhere out there, the paperwork still files, the ledgers still balance, the dividends still pay. And in a quiet room with soft light and the scent of coffee, a man with no past sits at a table with no name and writes another number in a notebook no one will ever read. Not for memory, not for posterity, just for accuracy. Inside a quiet cell, Fabio Ochoa Vásquez folds his sweater with the same care he once applied to moving $500,000 across 3 jurisdictions in under a week. The year is unknown. The hour doesn't matter. What matters is the atmosphere. Muted, constant, as if time itself has learned to walk softly around him. His cell is clean, but not obsessive. A small desk, a worn paperback in Spanish, a mechanical pencil dull at one end. There's a calendar on the wall with no marks on it. The days don't need counting. They arrive like figures in a ledger, steady, inevitable, never early. The guards still speak about him in hushed tones, if at all. New ones are warned not to mistake his quiet for fragility. He's not frail, they say. He's reserved. There's a difference, and you feel it the moment he looks up. In the mornings, he stretches for 15 minutes. Same motions, precise, controlled. At breakfast, he nods once to the kitchen worker and arranges his tray with perfect symmetry. Juice left, bread right, utensils aligned. The act isn't ritual, it's balance. A reminder that even here, order is his dominion. He rarely speaks. When he does, it's to ask short, thoughtful questions about a change in the staff rotation, about weather reports, about soybean futures in Paraguay. One guard once said, "It's like talking to a man who already knows the answer. He just wants to hear how you say it." His letters are fewer now. He writes maybe once a month. Legal pads filled with looping mechanical handwriting, all in Spanish. Sometimes he includes a diagram. Sometimes he writes only numbers. What he does with them, or who receives them, no one knows. He never watches TV. He requested the Wall Street Journal instead. He reads it slowly, sometimes twice. On Sundays, he rereads old articles, noting inconsistencies in long-term forecasts. Not because he cares, but because pattern is how he understands the world. When a fellow inmate once asked what he missed most from the outside, Fabio answered without hesitation, "The horses and a quiet room where no one misunderstands stillness. Many people still think Fabio regrets nothing, not because he's proud, but because everything he did was part of a calculated arc. Regret requires surprise, and Fabio's life never allowed for such errors. Every day he reviews numbers, not for profit, for calibration. The same way a watchmaker tests time even when no one wears the watch. Some nights, when the lights dim and the hallways settle, he sits on the edge of his cot and closes his eyes. He's not praying. He's not reflecting. He's calculating, walking through memory like a man auditing his own life. The stables, the meetings, the ledgers, the surrender, the silence, and then sleep. Not fast, not slow, just earned. After his transfer from U.S. federal prison, quiet, unmarked, and largely unannounced, Fabio Ochoa Vásquez slipped into what can only be described as infrastructural obscurity. Not public exile, not media exile. Something more elusive, systemic exile. You don't vanish by hiding anymore. Not in this era. You vanish by blending into the background noise of the machine you helped build. One day, he's in federal records. The next, he's in none. No extradition update. No press briefing. No follow-up photo outside an immigration checkpoint. Just a clerical entry that reads, "Transfer completed." Where to? Unspecified. And that's when things start moving again. A dormant property trust in the Cayman Islands submits a revision. A mid-tier law firm in Bogota, never linked publicly to the Ochoas, files a quiet petition for the reactivation of a 1984 corporate registration. A freight holding in Medellin updates its board, electing 2 new directors, both with surnames once buried deep in the Ochoa ledger. Coincidence? Perhaps. But timing? Timing never lies. Fabio was always more concerned with when than what. It was the rhythm that mattered. The flow. To him, nothing needed to be forced, only aligned. So when these subtle adjustments began appearing, some who still tracked such patterns didn't ask if he was involved. They asked, how long had this part been waiting? Many people still think that Fabio returned to Colombia not for freedom, but for maintenance. To observe what had continued without him. To walk the perimeter of the system he'd designed and see which walls held and which needed quiet repair. Because his structure wasn't just about hiding money. It was about preserving motion. A legacy of velocity that didn't collapse. It simply curved. He might have been invisible to most, but certain people knew. A regional banker in Medellin, old, nearing retirement, said in private, "Some payments stopped when he was gone. Now they've started again. Same amounts, same silence. No paper trail, no name, just precision." And then came the horses, not literally, but symbolically. A new breeder appeared in the Antiochian show circuit. Quiet reputation, impeccable bloodlines, no media, no interviews, just horses, moving with that same gliding gait Fabio had once been obsessed with. A passo fino with near-perfect symmetry, whose pedigree traced back to the exact stallion Fabio had once championed in the 70s. Insiders whispered, "He's back." But no one pointed. No one proved. It was a nod kind of truth. The kind of truth you keep in a drawer, not a headline. So what does a man like Fabio do once fully faded? He doesn't write a tell-all. He doesn't give TED Talks about leadership in the shadows. He just checks on things, keeps the circuits warm, makes sure the wheels, slow as they may be, still turn in the direction he once charted. There's a curious case that appeared in 2025, a minor land dispute in a rural Antiochian town. The property? Registered to an offshore trust. The challenge? raised by a local farmer who claimed his family had been paid for the land decades ago, but the ownership never transferred. The court didn't move quickly. It stalled. Then suddenly, without explanation, the case was withdrawn. The farmer? Relocated. Happily, it seemed. Quietly. A neighbor said he left with a suitcase and a smile. No one mentioned Fabio, but the trust handling the case had been inactive since 1993. It filed one document, then nothing again. This is how ghosts maintain relevance. Not through fear or fame, but through calibration. He doesn't interfere, he ensures. The mark of someone who doesn't need to speak loudly to be obeyed. And here's what's fascinating. The people who do speak about him now, if they do at all, don't call him a criminal. They call him an operator. Not in the clandestine sense, in the mechanical one. A man who knew how to run a thing, and maybe that's what disturbs people most. The idea that what he built wasn't chaos dressed in suits. It was order. Not just organized crime, organized precision. Because when you look closely, Fabio didn't just avoid prosecution, he avoided definition. He was never fully narco, never fully businessman, never fully anything, except exact. So what do you do with a man who never made a single false move? You wait. You wait for a misstep, a reveal, a name, a wire, a whisper, and when none comes, you begin to suspect. Maybe the story didn't end. Maybe it was filed away, carefully, neatly, balanced, just like everything else with his name on it. Even within the tangled, fractal history of organized crime, there's almost always a fracture point, a moment of chaos, betrayal, a fatal miscalculation that topples the edifice. But with Fabio Ochoa Vásquez, that moment never came. No intercepted call, no misplaced file, no brash move that undid it all. It was as if the very idea of disruption had been written out of his design. By now, those who once hunted him have either retired or pivoted. The agents are analysts now. The prosecutors are consultants. And in quiet rooms with glass walls and smart boards, they still occasionally run Ochoa simulations. Not to find him, but to test financial crime models against his known patterns. They never win. His algorithms, not in the digital sense, but in the human one, were too elegant, too anticipatory. While others hid funds in numbered accounts or art vaults, Fabio embedded his inside momentum. He understood that a system in motion, properly constructed, doesn't just carry wealth forward. It deflects attention. Many people still think Fabio succeeded not because he was better at hiding, but because he was better at not triggering suspicion. His wealth moved like weather, normal, seasonal, explainable. His companies were just boring enough to go uninspected. His staff, overqualified but unremarkable. His filings, on time. Every time. That's not laundering. That's camouflage with purpose. Back in Colombia, whispers persisted. A man matching his description seen at a veterinary expo in Pereira. A near-silent bidder on a Paso Fino stallion at a private auction in Bucaramanga. Nothing confirmed. Always at the edge of the room. Always just out of frame. And then, curiously, in 2025, a series of grants were issued by an agricultural research foundation in Medellin. The grants were generous, structured over 10 years, earmarked for rural water conservation. The foundation's public director claimed they came from a legacy portfolio. No names, no press. A reporter dug into the filings. The parent holding was based in Liechtenstein. Old, dormant until 2023. Its original incorporator? A Swiss firm whose 1988 founding documents list an obscure proxy named F.O. Vásquez. The reporter never published the story. Some forces, after all, aren't hostile. They're simply discouraging. And this is the truth Fabio always understood. If you never act in a way that requires explanation, no one has a reason to ask. He didn't rely on loyalty. He relied on design redundancy. Every entity he built had a fallback. Every contact had a buffer. Even his own absence had value. So others could point to the vacuum and say, "See, he's gone. It's over." But systems don't mourn their architects. They function without them. There's a theory, repeated among financial crime experts, that Fabio developed an internal doctrine in the 1990s called the zero-touch principle, that a truly effective operator should be able to step away entirely without any part of the structure breaking or even wobbling. Whether that doctrine ever existed on paper is debated, but its effects are visible in places you wouldn't expect, like regional cooperatives that have outlasted economic downturns, or investment funds that show consistent returns despite being managed by directors no one has met in person. Fabio didn't want resilience. He wanted continuity without question, and this made him not just dangerous, but disarming. Prosecutors said, "He's too calm." Diplomats called him strangely non-threatening. Even the press couldn't generate the drama needed to make him a household name, because Fabio never gave them a moment. No meltdown, no rant, no shotgun escape, just measured steps, polished shoes, one small ledger at a time. So what do you do when the man has become less important than the machine? You don't chase the man. You chase the geometry. You look at firms that behave just a little too elegantly, at networks that always seem one step ahead of new regulation, at companies that pass every audit, not because they're lucky, but because someone built them with 2040 in mind, back in 1985. One anti-money laundering expert recently said, "Sometimes I review an entity and feel like I'm looking at a ghost. Then I realize I'm looking at its architect's fingerprint. Not recent, just eternal." In a way, that's what Fabio always aimed for. Not immortality of name, but immortality of function. To build something that never declared itself, but always knew where it stood. And if you believe some of the stories, that's exactly what he does now. He rises with the sun, drinks warm coffee, walks the field perimeter at the same time each morning, reviews purchase logs, recommends soil rotations, speaks only when needed, watches the gate from a shaded window, and when the day ends, he journals, not in memoir, but in column and line like he always has, because the machine still runs, and as long as it does, Fabio doesn't need to return. He just needs to remain aware. There's a certain point in any long game where presence becomes a liability, and absence becomes a form of authorship. That was the transition Fabio Ochoa Vásquez had planned for from the beginning. Not to disappear, but to become unnecessary. And that's exactly where he found himself. By 2026, even the most tenacious analysts stopped expecting a headline. The world had shifted to new villains, cyber cartels, encrypted dark web markets, decentralized networks run by users younger than Fabio's ledgers. But in boardrooms, banking summits, and behind frosted glass compliance departments, the name Ochoa still carried weight. Not urgency, not threat, just relevance. Because the systems he'd built weren't traps. They were tracks. Money still moved where he taught it to move. Companies still used the risk calculation models he'd embedded into transactional behavior decades prior, and the countries where his old accounts once passed through, they now passed entire legislative acts to try and close the holes he had quietly drawn in blue ink on Caribbean hotel stationery in 1987. Many people still think that Fabio's real export wasn't cocaine. It was method. And method has no borders, no shelf life, no mugshot. In Colombia, a former prosecutor turned senator, made a curious statement during a finance corruption hearing. He said, "The ghost of the Medellin cartel isn't found in prisons or graveyards. It's found in how we process paperwork." No one had to ask whose ghost he meant. Meanwhile, in certain pockets of Medellin's hills, the locals still told stories of a man who came to town once a month for supplies, who paid an exact change, who asked no questions but always thanked the clerk. One boy said he saw him reading a magazine upside down, not out of error, but to scan it for layout patterns. He said, "That man doesn't read, he calculates." And the myth turned another page. There was also talk of a small chapel funded anonymously, of a teacher's fund that received deposits from a firm no one remembered hiring, of land sold at half price to a reforestation project, but only after the buyer could explain in detail how they'd reinvest the profit back into the community. The seller's name never appeared, but the contract was perfect. And here's where the lines begin to blur, because Fabio never needed to be seen to shape outcomes. He just needed systems that still trusted his logic. There was one particularly haunting moment, recorded offhandedly in a Colombian finance conference. A guest lecturer spoke about legacy trusts and referred to a structure still used across South America. "Its origin is debated," he said. "Some say it was built by a Swiss architect, others by a Colombian rancher." He smiled. "The truth is, it was built by someone who knew when to vanish." Those in the know didn't laugh. They just nodded, because at this point, the question isn't whether Fabio Ochoa Vásquez is active. It's whether he needs to be, and that's the brilliance of his design. Perpetual autonomy. A structure so elegant that it functions without input, like a wind-up clock, ticking long after the key has been pocketed. He doesn't need to call anyone. He doesn't need to remind. He doesn't even need to watch. The system remembers. Still, there are those who look. A young investigator in Bogotá builds a digital model of laundering networks and realizes one cluster keeps balancing too evenly, too consistently. She digs, finds an offshore link, a shell director, a cargo shipment timed with uncanny precision. No law is broken, but something feels authored. And then she finds the firm's foundation date, July 1984. Too early for a modern fintech venture. Too late for coincidence. She asks a retired colleague what it means. He shrugs. "Sometimes we're not tracing crime, we're tracing architecture." And that's where Fabio remains. Not in hiding, not on the run, but as a methodology, dispersed, embedded, and, most dangerously, respected. So what do you do with a man who left no mess, who caused no spectacle, who asked for no forgiveness and demanded no remembrance? You study him. You teach his name not in criminal ethics, but in systems theory, in classes about how money behaves when designed to be unmemorable, because that's what he mastered. The unremarkable, the quieted account, the unnoticed signature, the pattern of absence so consistent it becomes presence. There's a final story, told only once, by a land surveyor in the Magdalena region. He was hired to map a farm for a boundary dispute. The owner never appeared. But when the surveyor stepped into the main house, he saw a single sheet of paper on the kitchen table. It had 3 numbers, a name of a river, and the words, "Balance due, paid in silence." The surveyor didn't report it. He folded the paper and walked away. And maybe that's the closing line Fabio always wanted. Not a confession, not a eulogy, just a final entry in a ledger no one was ever meant to open. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How a man who built an empire of silence could become louder in absence than most ever were in presence. By 2027, law schools in Europe were teaching case studies not on his crimes, but on the resilience of his architecture. There were white papers on legacy laundering, on intergenerational asset rooting, and on sovereign risk displacement. And quietly, at the footnotes of these reports, somewhere in the theoretical lineage of these frameworks, sat a simple phrase, modeled after early Ochoa-type systems. Not Fabio Ochoa Vásquez anymore, just Ochoa-type, because when your name becomes a suffix to method, you've succeeded in doing what few ever manage, transforming from man to mechanism. But back home in Colombia, if you listened more carefully, not in airports or high-rises, but in the hills, in the shade of eucalyptus groves, you'd still catch a hum beneath the quiet. Not a rumor, not quite. More like patterned stillness. Horses walking with impossible precision. Trucks leaving no trace. Ledgers balanced so perfectly, they almost feel like music. There's a veterinarian in Rio Negro who swears she once treated a prized stallion whose bloodline was identical to a famous Paso Fino from the 1980s. One Fabio bred himself. The paperwork said otherwise, of course. A new breeder's name, new signature. But the gait? She said it moved like memory. And then there are the banks, no longer in Panama or the Caymans, but in Serbia, in Mauritius, in niche digital platforms that claim to be decentralized, but still show signs of something older underneath. A subtle configuration of transactions, triple-stacked delays, cross-jurisdictional obfuscation, mirrored disbursements that cancel each other out with eerie elegance. Who designed something like that? Not a new player, not someone hungry for clout, someone patient, someone who's already won. Many people still think Fabio had a final move planned, a reappearance, a legacy revelation. But those who knew him best say otherwise. He didn't want to be remembered, one old associate claimed. He wanted to be irrefutable. That's different. Remembering is for monuments. Irrefutable is for systems. And systems don't need applause. They just need to work. There's a rare conversation between two old cartel accountants captured accidentally during a separate investigation in 2026. They were arguing over whether a certain financial anomaly in a Guatemalan infrastructure fund matched the old patterns. One of them laughed and said, "If it still runs that clean, it's either Swiss or it's Fabio." That tells you all you need to know. He no longer needs to issue instructions. His presence is inferred in outcomes, in overperformance, in untraceable efficiency. So what happens when a ghost becomes a standard? You stop calling it haunting. You start calling it design. And design has no moral center. It simply behaves. Somewhere on a ranch in Antioquia, a man walks to the edge of a sloped hill and watches as dusk falls. He stands still for a moment, hands clasped behind his back, then turns toward a small stable. Inside are records, not secrets, maintenance logs, grain ratios, veterinary appointments. But beneath the floorboards, maybe something else. A file, a diagram, a folded page with instructions no one's read in years. But that still apply. Because time doesn't erode systems. Incompetence does. And Fabio planned for that too. One final detail. In 2027, a Colombian university announced a new endowment fund for rural education. Fully funded. Quiet launch. No press blitz. But one journalist noticed that the charter's financial architecture used a trust structure that hadn't been common since the 1980s. He wrote a blog post titled "The Return of the Ghost." It was deleted within 24 hours. Reposted, deleted again, then forgotten. Like all things in Fabio's orbit, it simply faded. So what do you do finally? When the ledger closes, the lines align, and nothing is out of place. You step back, you breathe slowly, and you recognize that not all power explodes. Some power balances. Some power was always meant to outlive the people who feared it. Some power still walks quietly past your window without a sound because it never needed your permission. It just needed the lights to be low enough that no one asked where the money went. And in that darkness, still walking, still watching, is the man who accounted for everything. Even this, there comes a point in every story where the names begin to fade and only the mechanics remain, where the legacy of a figure is no longer measured in biography, but in blueprint. And by 2028, that's what Fabio Ochoa Vásquez had become. Not a memory, but a method. Some systems break when their creators die or disappear. Others ossify, locked in time. But Fabio's didn't. His architecture was designed to evolve, not through reinvention, but through redundancy. His empire, if it could still be called that, no longer depended on loyalty or muscle. It relied solely on formulas that never drew attention. In a compliance seminar hosted by an international risk advisory firm, a speaker described the concept of legacy laundering, the idea that wealth, once illicit, could be passed through so many layers of function and legality that it emerged on the other side untraceable, unbothered, inevitable. He clicked to the next slide. The title, Case Study, Ochoa Persistence Models. The room was silent. Many people still think the greatest act of laundering Fabio ever committed wasn't with money, but with identity. He never faked who he was. He simply made who he was disappear into what he'd done. A kind of inverse immortality. And so, a trust opens in a small country in Central Africa. Its terms are identical to one written in Panama in 1985. A freight contract shifts hands in a deal brokered by a firm with a near-identical logo to a Colombian logistics brand dissolved in 1992. And a mid-sized hotel in Quito accepts a loan from a holding group that doesn't appear in any global registry, except for a whisper of it once in a Cayman Island ledger from the old days. Coincidence? Or choreography? Meanwhile, in the Colombian highlands, the man with no public name continues his quiet circuit. Grain, feed, budgeting, letters, always handwritten. He no longer uses calculators, not because he can't, because he doesn't need to. The numbers exist in his head like songs remembered from childhood. He's not watched, not followed, not listed, but the gate to his property is always oiled, always closed, never locked. A journalist once tried to approach him under pretense, posing as an agricultural investor. She was welcomed, escorted, fed. He answered every question about breeding ratios and pasture irrigation, never asked for her credentials, but at the end of the conversation, he placed a file gently on the table and said, "This is what you came for." Inside blueprints, not of buildings, of processes, outdated seemingly, diagrams of old laundering flows, obsolete entities, jurisdictions that no longer offer protection. But when she tried to trace one of the diagrams afterward, just out of curiosity, it led to an active mining logistics firm in West Africa. Its parent company? A timber firm in Norway? Its trustee? An elderly couple in Portugal, both deceased. She didn't publish, not because she was afraid, because she realized something. The more she pulled the thread, the less clear the origin became. Not more, less. She left the ranch with a handshake and a note. "Thank you for your time." He nodded. No need for more, because at this stage, Fabio didn't need to lie, hide, or silence anyone. His system was so complete, it metabolized scrutiny. And here's the eerie part. The deeper governments try to reform their regulatory systems, the more they rely on principles that look like his. Not because they admire him, because his models worked. A compliance analyst in Brussels once said, "It's as if the global financial system evolved toward his structure, not because it's criminal, but because it's efficient." Think about that. The man who once made governments chase paper trails through 30 countries might now have his designs embedded in the very reforms meant to stop people like him. That's not irony. That's elegance. So what remains? A quiet man, a tidy ledger, a stable full of horses, and a system that no longer needs direction. You don't build empires that last by being feared. You build them by becoming unnecessary to them. That was always his endgame. Not escape, not forgiveness, not a final flourish. Just the knowledge that what he built still moves, not loudly, not recklessly, not even visibly, just steadily. And if someone someday uncovers it, they'll realize too late that by then, it's not a crime. It's just how the world works now. As with all things built to last, there comes a moment when even the originator steps back, not in retirement, but in relevance retraction. The architect dissolves into the architecture. That's where Fabio Ochoa Vásquez now exists, as an abstraction. A name you say only if you know how to say it softly. A formula that functions whether spoken aloud or not. In late 2028, an unusual trend appeared in offshore compliance reports. Several long-dormant companies filed identical annual declarations on the same day. Different jurisdictions, different industries, but all citing, in footnotes, Article 12 of Legacy Financial Trust Standards 1989, a clause that doesn't officially exist, or does it? Because if you comb through enough of Fabio's old filings, those visible in archives or court evidence, you'll find a phrasing pattern, a legal syntax that repeats. The term legacy authorization clauses, never challenged, never clarified. And now, nearly 40 years later, that ghost language is being adopted by legal advisors who were in diapers when Fabio surrendered. Not because it's criminal, because it's clearer than the laws we have now. Many people still think that Fabio's final innovation was laundering money. But those who study him now know better. His final act was laundering influence, not just erasing tracks, but repackaging knowledge so seamlessly that future institutions would unknowingly rely on his thinking to combat his thinking. That's not just genius, that's recursion. And in Medellin, the whispers have thinned, but not disappeared. There's a new community center in a hillside barrio. Clean water, Wi-Fi, solar lighting. No donor name. Just a plaque on the gate that reads, "For those who keep quiet and build well." Locals say it was funded by someone who used to know the brothers. But everyone has a different story about which brothers they mean. Fabio never wanted monuments, but he left functions that became their own proof. If a clinic stands, if a road holds, if an account continues to compound interest through 3 name changes and no board meetings, you found one. He was never sentimental. He was systematic. Yet there's still something poetic in how these echoes manifest. Not through statues, but through sustained motion. There's a story, mostly myth, that Fabio once told a lawyer during his extradition period. "If I do it right, one day a government will use my own structure to protect their citizens from people like me." A paradox, or just precision, because systems don't care who designed them, they just operate. Today, in modern criminal analysis, his footprint appears in anomaly reports, not as a suspect, but as a comparison. This case shows Ochoa-tier compartmentalization, one analyst wrote. That's the level now. Ochoa-tier. No longer a man, just a benchmark. In the hills, the man known to a few as Don Fabio continues his routines. Morning walks, ledger maintenance, occasionally a visitor. Never for long, always discreet. A boy delivering supplies once asked him if he had any family. Fabio paused. "Everyone has family," he said. "The question is whether they inherit your name or your instructions." That night, the boy told his father, who told a friend, who told a journalist. The journalist didn't write it down. He just remembered it. Some stories don't need recording. They need respect. And maybe that's the only currency Fabio ever truly cared about. He never wanted to dominate. He wanted to influence through invisibility, to build things so efficiently that they absorbed criticism, absorbed suspicion, absorbed failure, and still worked. He was a man who left rooms cleaner than he found them, accounts more stable, names harder to trace. And now, as the world turns under new empires and louder criminals, Fabio remains unburdened by the need to be noticed, because his silence is no longer absence, it's proof of operation. So what do you think? Does the man fade with the legend? Or does the legend rewrite itself every time a clean transaction hides a dirty origin under a clause no one can quite pin down? Maybe he's still writing. Maybe he's still watching. Maybe it's enough that his design still balances. In the end, he never needed an ending. Just a system that runs without pause. By the time 2029 arrived, Fabio Ochoa Vásquez had not been seen in a courtroom, on a byline, or in any digital footprint for nearly 2 decades. And yet, in quiet offices across the globe, his presence lingered, not as a criminal, not as a fugitive, but as a theory. Law enforcement agencies no longer referred to him in the present tense. They referred to his model. Atypical Ochoa layering. FO-compliant front entity. His initials, FOV, had become code in certain internal memos, not to reference a man, but to flag a design style, because that's what survived, the shape of his thinking. Many people still think that Fabio's greatest defense was legal firepower, but truly, it was relevance attenuation, the art of becoming so structurally unimportant that dismantling him would only interrupt the flow of things that institutions now depended on. He wasn't hiding under a rock. He'd become part of the road. In 2029, an investigative project by a European think tank was quietly shelved after initial findings suggested that a large portion of agricultural investment funds in post-conflict zones in Latin America followed cash flows that, structurally, mirrored 1980s cartel-era laundering chains. Only now, the money came from multilateral banks. The oversight was real. The reporting was clean. But the flow? Too precise to be organic. The report never published. Instead, the researchers were offered grants to study emerging financial integrity in legacy regions. That too was on brand for Fabio. Co-opt criticism, redirect its energy, and keep the system moving. Back on the quiet ranch, the man still keeps his hours. Mornings in the saddle, afternoons with the books, evenings by lamplight. A neighbor once offered to install fiber internet on his property. In case you ever want to be connected, they said. Fabio declined with a smile. Everything I needed to say was already sent. He wasn't being poetic, he was being literal, because, in 1986, Fabio wrote what many now believe was the core of his philosophy, scribbled into the corner of a ledger margin. The most resilient systems are those that forget their architect. He understood this before most understood global finance. In a remote office of a Dutch security agency, an algorithm designed to flag financial irregularities tripped over a cluster of identically structured companies operating in 3 countries, none of which shared directors or industry sectors, but all used the same invoice format, same phrasing, same currency hedging logic. A junior analyst flagged it as unusually clean. She wasn't wrong. That's how his system camouflaged itself, by being too perfect to question. And that's what haunts the legacy of Fabio. Not the crimes, not the escape, not the courtroom silences. What haunts is how well it still all works. Because even now, shipments arrive on time. Dividends process without delay. Consultants bill through entities whose origins are as ancient as they are unbreachable. No one's laundering. They're just using what works. And what works is what Fabio built. So what do you do then with a man like that? One who no longer exists, but whose systems are embedded in the global bloodstreams of finance, logistics, compliance. You can't arrest him. You can't disprove him. You can only inherit him. Because silence doesn't mean disappearance. Silence means installed. He is, quite literally, the legacy code running beneath today's operating system. That's why his name doesn't trend. That's why his crimes aren't binge-watched. That's why his story doesn't end. It continues. Just like a clean ledger, just like a well-fed horse, just like an invoice paid 5 days early through a company that no longer technically exists. There is no final chapter. There is only the soft hum of a spreadsheet aligning, of interest compounding, of operations completing themselves in a room where no one even asks anymore how they began. And in that silence, right there, you'll find him, exactly where he planned to be, still, balanced, undisturbed. The paradox of Fabio Ochoa Vásquez is that the deeper you study him, the less you know him. Like staring into a mirror that reflects not a face, but a pattern. One that loops and folds and somehow always returns to stillness. In 2030, a graduate student at an American university writes her thesis on the psychology of organized financial behavior. She includes a chapter titled Legacy Logic, the Ochoa Method. It's speculative, built mostly on observation of long-term patterns, cross-border registrations, and financial behaviors too synchronized to be accidental. She submits it, thinking it too abstract for serious notice. 6 months later, her advisor receives a quiet offer from a private think tank asking to license parts of the analysis. Not for publication, for internal training. Many people still think Fabio's story ends in some obscure ranch with a quiet man and his horses. But increasingly, there's a competing theory. Not that he died or that he escaped, but that he simply disengaged. He reached a point where his systems needed no maintenance, no updates. They simply executed. A hedge fund executive in Singapore jokes at a conference, "I'd give anything to hire whoever trained the guy who structured these Uruguay trusts." Someone else replies, "Too late. He trained the guy who trained your regulator." It's not even hyperbole anymore, because by now, Fabio's way of thinking has filtered through generations of hands, not intentionally, not by dictation, but by design drift. The way a coral reef forms from fragments of long-gone creatures. A customs agent in Chile notices a container clearance that's too smooth. The paperwork, the cargo, the route, all clean. But something in its perfection itches at him. He flags it, tracks it. Nothing illegal, just structured like something older. Something he studied in his first year on the job. He shakes his head. That looks like Ochoa timing. The container clears. Because there's nothing wrong. There's just something familiar. Back in Colombia, the hills remain quiet. Fabio's ranch looks the same. Paint peeling in places. Fences mended without flair. Function over appearance. A local delivery boy once asked him what he does all day. "I adjust what no one sees," Fabio said. That boy grew up to be a logistics coordinator. Years later, when his company faced a sudden audit, it was his quiet familiarity with outdated, but effective, record-keeping that saved the operation. When asked where he learned that method, he just said, "An old man with calm eyes taught me, so here we are." In a future Fabio never claimed to shape. And yet, it bears his fingerprints. In an age of algorithms, instant transparency, and blockchain oversight, his model still fits. Not because it defies tech, but because it anticipated it. He understood that control doesn't come from secrecy. It comes from being the quietest link in the chain. There's a popular phrase now in certain banking circles: check the Ochoa layer. It means, if everything looks perfect, check the level beneath, because that's where he lived. Not at the top of the pyramid, not buried in the foundation, but in that middle layer of silence, where authority ends and automation begins. So what do you do with that? You don't chase it. You don't break it. You learn from it. And in doing so, you become one more part of it. Because maybe that's what Fabio wanted all along. Not control, not fear, just continuity. A design so seamless, so stable that it doesn't require permission to endure. He didn't need legacy. He just needed duration. And as long as freight still moves on time, funds arrive a day early, and reports balance with eerie elegance, then Fabio is still here, just not where you're looking. By 2031, the myth of Fabio Ochoa Vásquez had become something else entirely. A quiet doctrine passed between those who work in the shadows of systems, not to glorify crime, but to understand permanence. He was no longer spoken of in criminal terms. He was referenced in continuity discussions. His principles were taught not in criminal justice seminars, but in risk governance frameworks. Not because he evaded detection, but because what he built outlived the need for detection. In a closed-door panel on international financial ethics, a retired World Bank official remarked, "We're not afraid of criminals. We're afraid of designers who don't make mistakes." There was no laughter. Many people still think that Fabio's strategy was about outsmarting the system, but it wasn't. It was about becoming so necessary to it, so quietly useful, that the system began to lean into his logic unconsciously. And isn't that the ultimate hiding place? Not under aliases or passports, but within function, within expectation. Somewhere in a boutique firm in Toronto, a financial forensic analyst reviews a case involving microtransactions routed through Southeast Asian remittance platforms. The numbers don't match criminal behavior, but they align too well. Predictable lags, balanced transfers, risk smoothed to statistical invisibility. She flags it in her notes with a question. Ochoa resonance? No one needs to ask what that means. Meanwhile, in the soft hills outside Medellin, a fog settles each morning. Horses graze, machines hum, and the man at the center of all this, not the myth, but the mind, sits with a pencil and a small book of numbers. Nothing extravagant, just observations, ratios, shifts in demand, anomalies in fuel pricing. He doesn't need to act on them. He just likes to notice. An old friend visits, one of the few who still remembers when and how it all began. They speak little, but at one point, watching the clouds roll in over the ridge, the friend asks, "Do you think they know?" Fabio doesn't look up. "They don't need to," he says. "It's already happening." That's the final genius, isn't it? To orchestrate something so durable that its creator becomes irrelevant. There's an elegance in that. A surrender that's actually a form of permanence. Most men want to be remembered. Fabio just wanted things to work. Long after the world stopped asking who made this, a private bank in Geneva runs a simulation of high-risk exposure for mid-tier clients. One portfolio performs with uncanny precision. Not excessive returns, sustainable ones. The type that attract no attention. That maintain compliance ratios to perfection. The lead analyst digs. Nothing illegal. But the asset routing logic, strangely familiar. She notes a pattern she learned in a financial history elective, buried between chapters on Escobar and contraband banking. She leans back and mutters, "Classic FOV." She doesn't flag it. She lets it ride. And maybe that's the greatest testament of all. Not fear, not respect, but trust in the system you quietly designed. Fabio never wanted to fight the world. He wanted to program it. And in some strange, subtle way, he succeeded. Not because his face was feared, but because his flow was frictionless. You can't raid that. You can't indict that. You can only adapt to it. And so, 1,000 little decisions are made every day, by bankers, by auditors, by regional directors, following habits they didn't invent, guided by frameworks they never questioned. And somewhere, The man who first designed those arcs, those gentle rules of balance and timing, sips coffee on his porch, not triumphant, just aware that he's still here, not in person, but in protocol. It begins with a whisper, not a roar. A small advisory firm in New Zealand discovers that a hedge fund they're auditing is quietly routing disbursements through 4 shell companies in the British Virgin Islands. Not illegal, just efficient. And when pressed, the fund's compliance officer shrugs. Its legacy structure precedes me. They move on, because these days, unless the wheels are falling off, no one asks who built the axle. And that was always Fabio Ochoa Vásquez's quiet prophecy, that eventually the systems of the world would bend toward designs that made things move, not because they were legal, not because they were ethical, but because they were repeatable. And what's more repeatable than a model that erases its own fingerprints? Many people still think that his story is one of evasion, that the point of his silence was to avoid capture. But the more you examine the long tail of his methods, the clearer it becomes. His silence wasn't absence, it was submission to function. In 2032, a newly minted financial minister in a South American country unveils a radical reform package. It includes decentralizing certain investment approvals, digitizing others, and creating multi-tiered oversight filters with staggered timestamps. A minor note in a financial blog points out, this is oddly similar to a protocol used by Medellin-era smuggling networks. No retraction is issued, no clarification follows, because somewhere along the way, the world decided to stop asking where good systems came from, as long as they functioned. And function, Fabio's systems still do. In rural Antioquia, his porch creaks under an old chair. The man himself is older now, shoulders narrower, fingers slower, but the ledger still opens each morning. The tea still brews. The horses still walk their perfect, quiet routes. A visitor once asked if he still considered himself a criminal. He smiled, not in amusement, but in recognition of the futility of the question. I used to break rules to survive, then I built rules. Now people survive inside them, and in that answer lies the final thesis. Fabio didn't just walk away from crime. He built a new architecture of continuity, one where wealth is not hidden, but distributed so invisibly that it doesn't resist. It blends, where identity is not erased, but diffused through practice, until no single moment reveals intention. And in the quiet of that transformation, something extraordinary happened. The man vanished. The method remained. And now, somewhere in the hum of financial servers, in the shuffle of bills through layered companies, in the gentle clink of coins across smart contracts and analog handshakes alike, Fabio's touch lingers. But you won't find a statue. You won't see a tribute. You'll just feel a certain smoothness in systems that shouldn't be so efficient. That's his legacy. Not gold, not fear, not fame, but design that doesn't ask permission. Design that doesn't retire. Design that outlives the designer. And so, if you're listening to this now, somewhere with the lights dimmed and the windows cracked just enough for a breeze, you're resting not just in story, but in structure. A story that ends not with a bang, but with a ledger balanced, a chair pushed in, and the echo of someone who got away with it. Not by running, but by teaching the world to keep running his way. No curtain falls, no sirens blare, only the soft, rhythmic tick of a system still in motion. A system built by a quiet accountant with eyes on forever. And now, as the last echoes of Fabio Ochoa Vásquez's ghost fade into the folds of memory and mist, let's leave the ledgers behind. Let your breath slow. Let your jaw unclench. You've made it through a labyrinth of quiet brilliance, of puzzles hiding in plain sight, of balance sheets so clean they became poems. There's something oddly comforting about it all, isn't there? That somewhere, someone once thought far enough ahead not to conquer the world, but to slip beneath its rhythm and become part of it. No applause, no exit music, just quiet continuity, just stillness that stays. So now, as your room stills and the night settles around you like warm fabric, imagine a soft wind brushing through mountain grass. Picture a man seated with a cup of black coffee, the kind that never cools too fast, his pencil resting near the ledger, his thoughts already elsewhere. You don't need to follow him. You've already been guided. You've walked with shadows and emerged calm, not because nothing stirred, but because everything made sense, quietly. That's the peace he earned. And maybe, in listening, that's the peace you've earned too. So tonight, release the narrative. Let go of the maps, the money trails, the whispered names. Breathe easy. You're safe here. The system hums. The world turns. The lights flicker, then dim. And the last thing you hear is not a voice, but a page gently turned.